The morning sun caught the glass and steel of Skyline Aviation's new hangar like a blade, slicing sharp shadows across 300 pressed suits and cocktail dresses. Phoenix heat already shimmered off the tarmac at 8:45, but inside the climate-controlled palace of aerospace engineering, champagne flutes clinked against the hum of carefully curated optimism. Diana Ashford stood at the podium in a charcoal suit that cost more than most monthly salaries, her auburn hair pulled back tight enough to suggest control, her smile calibrated to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. 6 months into the CEO chair her dead father built, she'd learned that every public moment was a test. Every handshake a potential ambush from the board of directors who watched her like wolves circling wounded prey. The dedication ceremony script called for recognition of Skyline's elite engineering team. She gestured toward the 10 men in matching Navy blazers standing stage left, their MIT and Stanford credentials glowing in the press release already uploaded to every financial news site that mattered. Dr. Julian Cross stood at the center, 36 years old and sharp as a scalpel, his tablet glowing with real-time diagnostics from the hangar's sensor array. Behind them, the crown jewel, a Gulfstream G700 worth $73 million, polished to mirror shine, ready to carry tech mogul Alexander Kane to Singapore tomorrow morning for a merger that would inject $1.8 billion into Skyline's future. Or bury the company if anything went wrong. Garrett Brennan worked the mop 40 feet from the stage, invisible in the gray coveralls that marked him as part of the infrastructure rather than the event. 41 years old, with hands that remembered when they designed stealth systems instead of cleaning them, he moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned that staying unnoticed was its own kind of survival. His daughter Natalie sat in the employee lounge beyond the glass partition, 8 years old and absorbed in a coloring book, her insulin pump a small bulge under her pink sweater. The glucose monitor on Garrett's phone showed stable levels, 112, the green number that meant another hour of peace before the next snack, the next calculation, the next moment of vigilance that defined his days now. Julian Cross stepped away from the stage to refresh his champagne, distracted by a text from the diagnostic AI about fuel pressure readings. He didn't see Garrett until the collision, until the crystal flute tilted and sent $200 of Veuve Clicquot cascading down the front of those gray coveralls, soaking through to skin. The liquid spread like accusation, dark and immediate. Diana's voice cut through the crowd before Julian could apologize, amplified by the podium microphone she'd forgotten to release. Her words carried to every corner of the hangar, bounced off aluminum walls, embedded themselves in the silence that followed. Security. This is a formal corporate event, not a homeless shelter. Remove this man immediately. 300 faces turned, camera phones lifted. The moment crystallized into the kind of public humiliation that would replay in Garrett's mind for months. The kind that made his jaw tighten and his daughter's eyes go wide through the glass partition. He didn't defend himself, didn't explain that Julian had walked into him, didn't mention that he'd mopped these floors for 7 years without incident. The shame wasn't in the champagne or the wet coveralls. It was in the certainty that Diana Ashford looked at him and saw nothing, nobody, a problem to be escorted away, rather than a person who might deserve even basic courtesy. Colonel Hayes Rutherford stood near the buffet table, 70 pounds heavier than his Air Force days, but still carrying the posture of command. His eyes narrowed at the scene, recognition flickering across weathered features. He'd known Garrett Brennan when that name meant something in defense circles. Before the hiding, Before the choice to disappear into maintenance work and diabetes management, and the careful architecture of a life built around one little girl's survival. Garrett's hand found Natalie's as security guards approached with the officious politeness of men doing a job they'd rather avoid. She looked up at him with questions forming, but he shook his head slightly, the gesture that meant later, "Not here, trust me." They walked out through the service entrance while Diana returned to her talking points about innovation and excellence, while Julian deleted the champagne incident from his mind as quickly as he'd delete a spam email, while 300 guests went back to their networking and their careful evaluation of Skyline's future prospects. The parking lot stretched hot and empty under climbing sun. Garrett's Ford F-250 sat in the far corner, 18 years old, with rust blooming along the wheel wells and a crack in the windshield he'd been meaning to fix for 3 months. Natalie climbed into the passenger seat without being told, buckled herself with the automatic competence of a child who'd learned early that life required systems and protocols. Her voice came small and confused against the truck's hot interior as Garrett started the engine and let the air conditioning cough to life. She wanted to know why the pretty lady had been so mean, why Daddy hadn't said anything, why people could be cruel for no reason at all. He told her what Catherine used to say, back when Catherine could still say anything, back before the cancer turned her voice into whispered fragments. Sometimes people only see the uniform instead of the person wearing it, and that's their blindness, not your failure. The radio crackled with the hangar's general frequency, a habit Garrett had never quite broken from his military days. He reached to turn it off, to drive away and pretend this morning hadn't happened, to pick up Natalie's insulin prescription and get back to the small, safe orbit they'd constructed together. But the sound stopped his hand halfway to the dial. Metal on metal. The whine of a starter motor cycling through ignition sequence. Once, twice, 3 times. The distinctive pattern of a turbofan engine refusing to wake up, followed by the silence that meant expensive failure. Even through the radio's compression, even across 200 yards of tarmac, Garrett's trained ear caught the timing. That click between fuel injection and spark, 0.23 seconds too late. The kind of micro delay that spoke of mechanical resistance rather than electrical malfunction. He closed his eyes and saw the system in his mind. The auxiliary valve assembly with its return spring and solenoid gate. The components that had to fire in precise sequence, or the whole ignition cascade failed. Brand new parts could fail, especially in the cure phase when molecular stresses settled into patterns invisible to cameras, but audible to experience. He'd heard this exact failure mode before, 7 years ago, on a different aircraft in a different life, back when people listened to him instead of escorting him from buildings. Natalie watched his face change, saw the transformation from humiliated janitor to something harder and more focused. She'd seen glimpses of this version of her father before, usually late at night when he thought she was asleep, when he'd sit in the garage staring at the old footlocker with its medals and memories. She asked if something was wrong with the big airplane, and he told her yes, probably, but it wasn't their problem anymore. Catherine's voice lived in his memory with perfect clarity, her final coherent words 3 years ago in a hospice room that smelled of industrial soap and resignation. She'd made him promise to stay safe for Natalie, to choose the ground over the sky, to let go of the need to prove himself to systems that valued credentials over competence. He'd kept that promise for 7 years. Traded the roar of fighter jets for the quiet hum of floor buffers, accepted invisibility as the price of presence in his daughter's life. 15 minutes crawled past on the dashboard clock. The radio continued its soundtrack of increasing desperation, voices tight with professional panic as Diana Ashford's carefully constructed morning disintegrated into crisis. 90 minutes until Alexander Kane's convoy arrived expecting a functional $73 million aircraft. 90 minutes until the deal that would save or sink Skyline Aviation, until Diana's tenure as CEO would be ratified or terminated, until 10 brilliant engineers with impeccable degrees would either solve an impossible problem or watch their reputations evaporate. Julian Cross's voice cut through the radio chatter with the kind of frustration that came from being certain of your expertise while reality stubbornly disagreed. Every diagnostic showed green. Every sensor reported nominal function. Every AI algorithm returned the digital equivalent of a shrug. The engine should start. The math said it would start. The screens promised it would start. But the machine refused to cooperate with theory. Garrett's phone buzzed with Natalie's glucose reading 98 and trending down, which meant a snack in the next 20 minutes and a meal within the hour. He had insulin in the cooler, crackers in her backpack, a routine that required precision and attention. Walking back into that hangar meant abandoning the careful schedule, risking the confrontation with Diana Ashford and her security team, exposing himself to the possibility that he was wrong, and the engine's failure had nothing to do with what his ear insisted it heard. But it also meant 12 people would board that aircraft tomorrow morning. 12 lives that would bet on Julian Cross's algorithms and sensor arrays. 12 souls trusting that green lights on screens translated to safety at 37,000 feet. Garrett had learned what happened when institutions trusted data over instinct, when credentials silenced experience, when the need to stay on schedule overrode the voice saying, "Wait, listen, something's wrong." Colonel Hayes Rutherford appeared at the driver's window like a ghost materializing from heat shimmer. He'd walked the 200 yards from the hangar in his dress uniform, ribbons catching sunlight, the limp from his last deployment barely visible, but always present. His knock on the glass carried authority that didn't require volume. Garrett rolled down the window. The colonel's face held neither accusation nor sympathy, just the flat assessment of a man who'd spent 40 years reading situations and making calls that determined whether people came home or came home in boxes. "Son, I know you heard it. Saw your face change when that engine cycled." The words hung there, neither question nor command, just statement of observed fact. Garrett stared straight ahead at the parking lot's heat waves, at the city beyond where normal people did normal work without carrying ghosts or broken promises. He heard himself saying he was done with that life, finished with the weight of knowing things that other people's systems couldn't measure. The colonel leaned closer, voice dropping to the register reserved for difficult truths. He pointed back toward the hangar where Natalie could see through the glass, where a little girl in a pink sweater represented every reason Garrett had for staying invisible and safe. "That daughter of yours needs you alive, healthy, home every night at 5:30. I respect that, but those 12 passengers boarding tomorrow morning, they need you too. Just in a different way, for different reasons." Garrett's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He thought about Catherine's deathbed promise, about the 7 years he'd honored her wish by choosing the ground. But he also remembered her other words, the ones from before the cancer, when she'd been strong enough to challenge him instead of just asking him to stay. She'd told him once that fear dressed up as caution was still just fear, that protecting Natalie meant teaching her to face hard things rather than building walls to hide behind. The radio crackled again. Diana's voice now, sharp with the desperation of someone watching a career implode in real time. 60 minutes until Kane arrived. board members calling with barely concealed satisfaction, circling for the kill. Security suggesting they lie. Tell Kane the plane needed routine calibration. Buy time they didn't have and wouldn't help anyway, because the engine would still fail when it mattered most. Natalie's hand found his on the steering wheel, small fingers wrapping around calluses that told their own story of manual labor and diminished ambitions. She didn't say anything, didn't have to. 8 years old and already learning the calculus of choices that mattered, the algebra of conscience that couldn't be solved by staying safe. Garrett restarted the truck and drove back toward the hangar. The colonel followed in his own vehicle, a slight smile suggesting he'd predicted this outcome from the moment he'd seen that engine fail to start. They parked near the service entrance, away from the departing ceremony guests and their oblivious conversations about quarterly projections and market positions. The main hangar floor stretched vast and bright, engineered for precision work on aircraft that represented fortunes in composite materials and computational genius. 10 engineers clustered around the G700's starboard engine like surgeons around a patient who refused to wake from anesthesia. Tablets glowed, sensors hummed, diagnostic cables snaked from access panels to laptops running algorithms written by people who'd never touched a wrench or felt an engine's vibration through bone. Diana Ashford stood apart from the technical scrum, phone pressed to her ear, her expression cycling through variants of controlled panic. She was explaining to someone important why confidence in their timeline might need revision, why certainty about departure had become probability, why the word perhaps had entered her vocabulary regarding matters that were supposed to be absolute. She saw Garrett before he'd taken 10 steps onto the hangar floor. Recognition flickered, then hardened into defensive anger. Her voice carried that same amplified authority from the podium, except now it vibrated with something sharper than social judgment. I told security to remove you. Are you actually stupid enough to come back for round 2? Garrett stopped 15 feet away, close enough to be heard without shouting, but far enough to signal he wasn't challenging her physical space. Natalie stood slightly behind him, her hand finding his again, anchor and reminder. He kept his voice level, stripped of emotion, focused only on the practical offer that might save lives or might get him thrown out twice in one morning. Ma'am, with respect, your team has been looking at screens for 50 minutes. I'm suggesting you let someone look at the actual plane. Give me 5 minutes or lose everything you're trying to protect. Julian Cross laughed, not with genuine humor, but with the dismissive reflex of expertise confronted by presumption. He stepped away from his tablet long enough to gesture at Garrett's coveralls, at the mop bucket still visible near the service entrance, at the absurdity of a janitor offering to solve problems that had stumped 10 graduate-level engineers. The janitor is going to teach us aeronautical engineering now? This I genuinely need to see. Please enlighten us with your extensive technical background in floor maintenance. Maybe the answer is, we need to mop the engine clean. The other engineers allowed themselves careful smiles, the kind that acknowledged Julian's wit while hedging against the possibility that Diana might actually be desperate enough to try anything. Natalie's hand tightened in Garrett's, feeling the tension coil through his arm. She'd never seen her father in a professional context, had no framework for understanding what this confrontation meant beyond people being mean to Daddy again. Diana's phone buzzed with another incoming call, another board member checking whether the disaster was contained or accelerating. She stared at Garrett for 3 long seconds, evaluating odds she couldn't properly calculate. CEO for 6 months, daughter of the founder, woman in a male-dominated industry where every decision would be examined for evidence of incompetence or hysteria. Trusting a janitor would make her a laughingstock if it failed. But the alternative was watching Kane walk away, watching the merger collapse, watching the board vote her out before sundown. Her voice came quiet and hard, each word a chip off the block of pride she was swallowing. 3 minutes, not 5. Fail in security would physically drag him from the building this time. Succeed, and she'd consider not having him arrested for trespassing. The clock on the wall showed 52 minutes until Kane's expected arrival. Garrett walked toward the engine, not hurrying, not performing confidence he didn't entirely feel, just moving with the steady competence of someone who'd done this particular dance before. He didn't reach for a tablet or ask for diagnostic readouts. He closed his eyes, tuned out the skeptical breathing of 10 engineers, and focused everything on listening. His voice came barely above conversational volume. Start it again. Someone in the cockpit cycled the ignition. The sound washed through the hangar, familiar as a heartbeat to anyone who'd spent years around turbofan engines. Hum as fuel pumps engaged, click as the solenoid gate actuated, rush as compressed air met atomized fuel, thud as the spark failed to catch, and the whole sequence died back to silence. Garrett's eyes stayed closed. Again. The pattern repeated, identical in every detail except the timing, the fractional delays that sensors couldn't measure because they were tracking electrical commands rather than mechanical responses. The third time through, he opened his eyes and pointed to the auxiliary valve housing, a component small enough that most of the engineers had to look twice to spot what he meant. That click. It's 0.23 seconds late. Your sensors are measuring the electrical signal sent to the valve, confirming the command was transmitted. They're not measuring whether the valve actually responded on time. You're reading the order, not the execution. You're checking the menu instead of tasting the food. Julian's expression cycled from dismissive to uncertain to defensive in the span of 3 seconds. His tablet showed green status on every auxiliary system, confirmation that commands had been sent and acknowledged. The data couldn't be wrong, which meant either the sensors were lying or the janitor was guessing. That housing was replaced 3 weeks ago during the 500-hour service interval. New components don't fail, especially not in ways that sensors can't detect. Garrett's response came without heat, just the flat certainty of someone who'd learned lessons written in other people's blood. New metal carried new stresses, molecular bonds settling into equilibrium during cure time, microfractures forming in patterns invisible to imaging but audible to experience. He'd heard this exact signature before, on a different aircraft in a different decade, back when people had ignored him because sensors said everything was fine and schedules said delay was unacceptable. Diana watched the exchange with the intensity of someone whose entire future balanced on the next 60 seconds. She saw Julian's confidence waver, saw the other engineers glance at each other with uncertainty, replacing certainty. She saw Colonel Rutherford standing near the entrance with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, neither validating nor dismissing the janitor's diagnosis. Most of all, she saw the little girl in the pink sweater watching her father with absolute faith, the kind of trust that didn't require credentials or proof, that simply believed Daddy knew what Daddy knew. Diana recognized that faith because she'd felt it once toward her own father, before he died in his office and left her alone to defend his legacy against men who'd smiled at him and undermined her. She made the call that would define her tenure as CEO, for better or catastrophic worse. Her voice carried across the hangar with the weight of burned bridges and impossible bets. "Open the housing, now." The auxiliary valve housing sat buried deep in the engine nacelle, accessible only by removing 3 protective panels and disconnecting 2 sensor arrays that immediately triggered warning lights on Julian's tablet. The lead engineer hesitated, fingers hovering over the safety wire cutters, calculating warranty implications and liability exposure, and the professional humiliation of following a janitor's instructions in front of colleagues who'd memorized his MIT thesis on predictive maintenance algorithms. Diana's expression left no room for continued deliberation. The cutters bit through twisted steel wire with a sound like breaking promises. 20 minutes to remove the housing. Torque specifications mattered. Bolt patterns couldn't be rushed. Composite materials required specific handling protocols to prevent delamination. Julian worked with mechanical precision despite the sweat darkening his collar, despite the clock on the wall announcing 47 minutes until Kane's arrival, despite Garrett standing 3 feet away with his arms crossed and his focus absolute. The housing finally came free, a cylinder of machined aluminum small enough to hold in 2 hands, complex enough to contain 17 separate components that had to function in perfect sequence or the entire ignition cascade failed. The engineering team gathered around the workbench under high-intensity LED lighting that turned shadows harsh and unforgiving. Julian produced a jeweler's loupe, the kind used for inspecting microcircuits and precision welds. He examined the valve assembly's exterior first, checking for obvious damage, corrosion, signs of impact or contamination. Nothing. The surface gleamed with the perfection of aerospace-grade manufacturing, tolerance measured in microns, quality control that should have caught any defect before installation. Garrett's voice cut through the inspection with quiet authority. The spring, internal return spring, coil number 3 from the actuator end. Julian's hands moved to disassemble the valve body, removing screws barely larger than grains of rice, separating components with tweezers because fingerprints could introduce oils that degraded performance over time. The return spring emerged last, a coil of high-tensile steel wire wrapped tight as compressed potential energy, designed to maintain precisely calibrated tension through 100,000 actuation cycles. Under the loop's magnification, the fracture appeared. Hairline crack in the 3rd coil, invisible to naked eyes, barely detectable even with optical enhancement. But there, definite, undeniable. The metal had failed not from obvious stress, but from molecular fatigue, bonds breaking at the atomic level, a weakness born during the curing process when residual stresses settled into patterns that wouldn't show on X-rays or ultrasonic testing, but would manifest as binding resistance, as delay measured in fractions of seconds, as the difference between ignition and silence. Julian's face went pale, not from embarrassment, but from the sudden recalibration of certainty that came from being absolutely wrong about something that should have been impossible. His diagnostic protocols had missed this. His AI algorithms had reported green status on a component that was mechanically failing in ways digital sensors couldn't perceive because they measured electrical signals rather than physical responses. The janitor, with no visible credentials, had diagnosed catastrophic failure using nothing but trained ears and hard-earned experience. The colonel's voice broke the silence with the tone of someone who'd seen this exact dynamic play out across 4 decades of military service. He asked Garrett a question everyone else was thinking, but nobody wanted to voice. "How long since you've done this kind of work, son?" The answer required context that Garrett had spent 7 years avoiding. Catherine's deathbed promise had bought him safety at the cost of purpose, invisibility in exchange for presence. but some truths demanded light even when darkness felt safer. The flashback came not as spoken explanation, but as memory that compressed time and expanded pain. Years of consequence condensed into images that never quite faded, regardless of how many floors he mopped or how carefully he avoided mirrors. Edwards Air Force Base in 2017 sprawled across California desert, under sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Garrett Brennan, at 34, carried the confident swagger of someone whose technical judgment had saved lives and advanced projects, whose acoustic analysis skills had detected flaws in stealth fighters that computer models missed, whose reputation meant colonels listened when he raised concerns. Captain Wyatt Sterling was his academy roommate turned test pilot turned best friend, the kind of bond formed by shared danger and mutual trust, by nights drinking cheap beer and debating aerospace engineering versus pure flying skill. The pre-flight briefing for the F-35 variant test focused on avionics upgrades and weapon systems integration, not on the hydraulic whine Garrett heard during final checks, 0.3 seconds off nominal timing, subtle enough that most technicians would dismiss it as normal variation, obvious enough to trained ears that something was binding or degrading or preparing to fail. He filed a report. The supervising colonel reviewed sensor data showing green across all hydraulic systems, consulted the project timeline showing 6 weeks behind schedule, weighed a contractor's acoustic concern against $40 million of diagnostic equipment that said everything was fine. Sterling climbed into the cockpit with his usual pre-flight joke about haunting Garrett's coffee if the bird dropped him. Takeoff clean, climb rate perfect, systems nominal through 15,000 feet. Then the catastrophic failure, hydraulic lines rupturing under pressure that shouldn't have been there, control surfaces freezing, ejection seat mechanism jammed by the same fluid leak that killed flight control. Sterling's voice over radio, calm even facing death because that's how pilots were trained, acknowledging that Ghost had called it right. Always trust the ghost. Then static and explosion and smoke trail against that painfully blue sky. Catherine, 8 months pregnant, attended the memorial service, stood beside Garrett while he accepted folded flags and formal condolences, held him together through guilt that rational analysis couldn't dissolve because Sterling was dead, and Garrett's warning had been dismissed, and the system that valued schedules over safety had killed a good man. She told him in the base housing parking lot afterward that they were leaving, taking their unborn daughter away from institutions that treated human judgment as unreliable compared to algorithmic certainty, starting over somewhere that didn't require fighting to be heard. Natalie arrived healthy in a Phoenix hospital far from military installations. Catherine's lung cancer diagnosis came 11 months later, stage 4 despite never smoking, despite clean air and healthy living, because cells sometimes mutated for reasons oncologists couldn't predict any better than engineers could guarantee perfect systems. 8 months of treatment that destroyed her body while trying to save her life. Hospice care in a room that smelled of resignation and industrial cleaning compounds. Her final coherent words making Garrett promise to stay safe for Natalie, to choose ground over sky, to let go of proving himself to systems that had already proven they wouldn't listen. The 7 years after Catherine's death compressed into montage of deliberate invisibility. Garrett at Skyline Aviation accepting maintenance positions, watching engineers from shadows, learning their names and methods and blind spots. Natalie growing from toddler to elementary student, asking why daddy didn't work on planes anymore, accepting answers about wanting to spend more time with her, not understanding that her father had traded purpose for proximity, because losing another person he loved was unthinkable. Diabetes diagnosis at age 6, adding medical complexity to emotional weight, insulin pumps, and glucose monitors, and the constant calculation of carbohydrates and activity levels and blood sugar trends that couldn't be delegated or forgotten. The hangar's fluorescent lighting snapped Garrett back to present moment, to 10 engineers staring at him with expressions ranging from respect to bewilderment, to Diana Ashford processing information that recontextualized the man she'd publicly humiliated 90 minutes earlier. Colonel Rutherford provided the formal introduction that Garrett wouldn't have offered himself, explained that Captain Garrett Brennan had been chief engineer for Air Force Advanced Systems Division, that his acoustic signature analysis had improved stealth capabilities on platforms still classified, that he'd walked away from defense contracts and prestigious positions to mop floors. Because sometimes the ghosts of failed interventions weighed more than any salary could balance. Julian found his voice first, defensive mechanisms engaging to protect ego, bruised by being wrong in front of subordinates. The question came out harsher than probably intended. If you had that background, why choose janitor work? Why waste expertise on maintenance tasks anyone could perform? Garrett's answer carried no anger, just exhausted honesty about learning that being technically correct mattered less than being able to save people you cared about, that expertise without authority was just noise, that he'd finished trying to prove competence to institutions that measured value in credentials rather than outcomes. He answered only to his daughter now, to the 8-year-old whose glucose monitor chose that moment to emit its warning chirp. Natalie's blood sugar had dropped to 87, not emergency territory, but trending downward, requiring intervention within 20 minutes to prevent hypoglycemic episode. Garrett checked his phone, calculated insulin versus carbohydrate ratios, looked at Diana with apology forming for needing to abandon the crisis he'd partially solved. She surprised him by suggesting he leave immediately, that the team could handle spring replacement now that they knew what needed fixing. But walking away meant returning to the careful orbit of safety and schedules, meant choosing invisibility again, just when visibility had proven its value. Garrett looked at his daughter through the glass partition, saw her waving to indicate she was okay for now, saw trust that didn't require him to stay small or hidden to keep her safe. The decision came without drama, just practical acknowledgement that fixing the plane first meant 12 people wouldn't die tomorrow, and Natalie's snack could wait the 30 minutes required to complete repair work. Diana's voice carried new authority when she ordered the housing replacement to proceed immediately. Julian started to mention warranty implications, got cut off mid-sentence by a CEO who decided that betting her career on the janitor's ears made more sense than trusting sensors that had already lied. The clock showed 42 minutes until Kane's arrival. Replacement spring retrieval, compound preparation, safety wire installation, each step requiring precision that couldn't be rushed. Garrett directed the team with surgical efficiency, assigning tasks based on who stood closest to needed tools rather than seniority or credentials, treating MIT graduates and apprentice mechanics with identical expectations of competence. 12 minutes elapsed in focused silence, broken only by technical communication, torque values and cure times and triple-check confirmations. The auxiliary housing went back into position with new spring tension calibrated to manufacturer specifications, safety wire twisted in patterns that would reveal any tampering, sensor arrays reconnected to Julian's tablet, showing green status that now actually meant something. 28 minutes until Kane. Diana authorized ignition test. Garrett stepped back, let the engineering team take credit for work they'd completed, kept his focus on listening rather than watching screens. The fuel pump engaged with its characteristic hum. The solenoid gate clicked precisely on time, no delay, no hesitation, mechanical response matching electrical command. Compressed air met atomized fuel at exact stoichiometric ratio. The spark caught. The Gulfstream's engine didn't just start, it roared to life with the smooth power of $73 million of aerospace engineering functioning exactly as designed. The sound filled the hangar, vibrated through concrete floors, announced success to everyone within 200 yards. Control room monitors showed green across every parameter. Fuel flow optimal, combustion temperature perfect, turbine rotation climbing to idle speed without stuttering or hesitation. Julian's team erupted in celebration, high fives and relieved laughter, and the giddy energy of crisis averted. Diana's phone buzzed with incoming call from the board member who'd been circling for her resignation. She answered with single-word confirmation that the aircraft was operational, that Kane's departure would proceed on schedule, that Skyline's future remained intact. Her voice stayed level, despite relief that must have felt like physical weightlifting. Garrett moved toward the exit, intending to get Natalie her snack and disappear back into maintenance schedules before gratitude turned awkward or expectations formed that he couldn't meet. Diana caught him before he'd taken 10 steps, asked how she could possibly repay someone who'd saved her company and career in the same morning. His answer came simple and honest. Insulin for his daughter, maybe acknowledgement that janitors might notice things engineers miss, nothing more complicated than basic courtesy. But something in the engine's sound pattern caught his attention, even through celebration noise. Not the main turbine, that was perfect. Something deeper in the accessory systems, a harmonic vibration in the fuel relay pump that would go unnoticed on ground operations, but would amplify at cruise altitude when cabin pressurization created differential loading. His expression shifted from relieved to concerned in seconds Diana had learned to read. The words came quiet, but absolute. Hold on. Everyone back. She's running now, but she'll fail at 37,000 feet. That oscillation in the secondary fuel relay, harmonic frequency that will resonate under altitude pressure, crack the housing seal, allow fuel vapor into pressurized cabin space. Explosive decompression over Pacific Ocean. If the flight path crosses weather systems that increase G-loading beyond 2.3, Julian ran diagnostic protocols that took 9 minutes, pulling data on resonant frequencies and stress thresholds and failure probability modeling. The results confirmed what Garrett's ears had detected, what his experience predicted. What would have killed everyone aboard if they'd trusted initial success without deeper investigation? The engineering team went silent again, recalibrating their understanding of what expertise actually meant, how sensors could report green while catastrophe waited at altitude. Diana made executive decision to delay Kane's departure 8 hours for relay replacement, accepted the professional risk of admitting continued problems rather than gambling lives on schedule convenience. Then she pulled Garrett aside to her office, away from engineering team and crisis management, into space that revealed more about her than any public performance could. The room still carried her father's presence in furniture choices and wall decorations, photographs of Harrison Ashford with aviation pioneers and political figures, the physical inheritance she'd received along with impossible expectations. Coffee came from an actual percolator rather than the industrial dispensers that fed the engineering floor, served in ceramic mugs instead of disposable cups. Diana's hands shook slightly as she poured, adrenaline crash hitting now that immediate crisis had passed into merely urgent timeline pressure. She offered apology for the morning's humiliation, explanation about board pressure and imposter syndrome, and trying to project authority she didn't entirely feel. Garrett accepted coffee without accepting apology, pointed out that she'd made the harder choice when it mattered by trusting judgment over credentials. They sat in chairs positioned for conversation rather than confrontation. Diana shared history about her father building Skyline with grease under fingernails, dying of heart attack in the CEO chair before seeing her take over. Board members who gave her his title while withholding genuine respect, constant evaluation that felt like waiting for permission to fail. The parallel to Garrett's situation emerged without being explicitly stated. Both of them watching themselves, anticipating failure, protective walls built against vulnerabilities that looked like weakness to people who valued certainty over honest uncertainty. Diana admitted that every decision felt like test she might fail, that hiring the janitor without credentials would make her laughingstock if the gamble hadn't paid off, that she envied Garrett's apparent confidence in his own judgment, even while hiding from professional contexts that might challenge it. His response surprised her by acknowledging Catherine's influence, that his dead wife had taught him the difference between survival and legacy, between showing up and showing others how. Diana noted that Catherine sounded remarkable, and Garrett's expression confirmed the assessment while also showing the grief that 7 years hadn't entirely processed. Relay replacement required 40 minutes. Test flight became necessary to verify fixes at actual operating altitude, but company pilot had called in sick with timing that seemed suspicious enough to warrant investigation later. Colonel Rutherford volunteered immediately, offered to take the Gulfstream up solo, but requested Garrett as co-pilot because sensors couldn't hear what trained human ears could detect at 37,000 feet. The request landed like physical weight. Garrett hadn't touched cockpit controls in 7 years, had kept that promise to Catherine through every temptation to return to work that felt like purpose instead of just employment. Natalie's insulin pump showed stable glucose levels, snack administered during relay replacement, medical crisis averted for the next several hours. But flying again meant breaking the protection he'd built around her safety, meant choosing the sky over ground literally and metaphorically. Natalie appeared at the office door before Garrett could formulate refusal, escorted by one of the engineers who'd noticed her watching the repair work with fascinated attention. She looked at her father with expression that combined understanding beyond her years with trust that didn't require explanations. Her voice came clear and certain. "Daddy, Mommy told me something before she went to heaven. She said you'd fly again when someone needed you. Not when you wanted to. These people need you." The wisdom of 8-year-olds sometimes cut deeper than adult analysis could reach. Garrett knelt to eye level, asked if she was sure, got confirmation that included hug and whispered encouragement. Diana watched the exchange with something like wonder, seeing the relationship that had kept Garrett grounded for 7 years, understanding that his return to flight required his daughter's permission because she was the reason for everything he'd chosen since Catherine died. The Gulfstream's cockpit wrapped Garrett in familiar configuration that muscle memory recognized even after 7 years' absence. Rutherford settled into captain's seat, ran through pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency, kept casual conversation flowing to ease tension visible in Garrett's white-knuckled grip on the yoke. Tower cleared them for departure. Engines spooled to takeoff power. The aircraft accelerated down runway with physics that felt simultaneously foreign and inevitable. Rotation speed. Wheels left tarmac. Phoenix dropped away below. Garrett's hands remembered procedures his conscious mind had tried to forget, adjusting trim and managing climb rate and coordinating with air traffic control through communications protocols unchanged since his last flight. The city became grid pattern, became terrain features, became abstraction of altitude. 37,000 feet. Cruise configuration. The predicted harmonic vibration that would have destroyed original relay. But the replacement component absorbed resonant frequencies, dampened oscillation, maintained fuel pressure within nominal parameters. Rutherford's voice carried satisfaction when he radioed ground control with confirmation that Skyline's $73 million asset was performing flawlessly thanks to their maintenance technician. Landing approach reversed the climb, brought them back to concrete and gravity, and the hangar where Diana and her team waited for confirmation that fixes had actually worked. Touchdown smooth enough that passengers wouldn't have spilled coffee. Taxiing to parking position, shutdown sequence that left only cooling metal sounds and the quiet satisfaction of precision work validated by real-world testing. But post-flight inspection revealed new complication. Ground crew found minor hydraulic fluid leak in nose gear assembly, small enough that it hadn't affected landing but significant enough to require investigation before passengers boarded. Diana ordered immediate inspection, contacted FAA for guidance, made decisions that prioritized safety over schedule, even knowing that Kane might withdraw from merger if delays continued. Media somehow learned about the grounding, ran headlines speculating about safety crisis, broadcast concern that tanked Skyline's stock price 8% in afternoon trading. Board members called emergency meeting, circled with renewed energy around CEO who seemed cursed by problems despite heroic efforts to solve them. Chairman Preston Vale's voice over speakerphone dripped with barely concealed satisfaction about vindication of his initial doubts. Diana found Garrett supervising nose gear inspection, pulled him aside with offers she'd been formulating since watching him save her company twice in 6 hours. Chief Safety Officer position, salary commensurate with expertise, authority to override engineering decisions when safety concerns warranted, chance to use skills that maintenance work wasted. The refusal came immediate and apologetic. Natalie needed stability, predictable schedules, father home at 5:30 every evening for dinner, and insulin management and homework help. Chasing redemption at 40,000 feet meant risking the only thing that mattered more than professional validation. Diana heard the decision, respected the reasoning, couldn't entirely hide disappointment that the best safety asset she'd ever encountered chose invisibility over influence. The nose gear hydraulic leak proved anticlimactic after morning's drama. A simple O-ring degradation that any competent mechanic could diagnose and remedy in 40 minutes. Julian's team completed the replacement with efficiency born from renewed respect for mechanical fundamentals, checking their sensor readings against physical inspection, learning the lesson Garrett had taught without explicitly teaching. The green lights on their tablets now came with asterisks of healthy skepticism, validation rather than gospel truth. But Garrett couldn't shake the disquiet that had settled over him during the test flight, the sense that the Gulf Stream was whispering secrets only partially revealed. Aircraft this complex rarely failed in single-point fashion, especially when initial problems suggested systemic issues rather than isolated component degradation. He walked the perimeter of the fuselage while others celebrated the hydraulic fix, letting his hands trail along composite skin, feeling for vibrations that shouldn't exist, temperature differentials that indicated stress concentration, anything that might explain why his instincts screamed caution while data proclaimed success. The tail section felt wrong. Not obviously, not in ways that visual inspection would catch, but wrong nonetheless. Garrett pressed his palm flat against the vertical stabilizer's root junction, felt the subtle wrongness transmit through skin and bone, resonance that spoke of internal strain rather than surface condition. He'd learned to trust these moments of irrational certainty, the body's ability to detect patterns before conscious analysis could articulate what they meant. Diana noticed him standing motionless with hand on tail assembly, expression distant like someone listening to music nobody else could hear. She approached with 2 bottles of water, offering hydration as excuse for interruption, really wanting to understand what made this man so fundamentally different from every engineer she'd hired or inherited. The afternoon heat had pushed Phoenix temperatures toward 112 degrees, turning tarmac into shimmering abstraction and making the hangar's climate control feel like sanctuary. Her question came direct without being demanding. What was he hearing now that sensors couldn't measure? Garrett's answer required context about composite materials and stress propagation, about how carbon fiber layering could delaminate internally while maintaining surface integrity, about failures that announce themselves through harmonic frequencies rather than visible cracks. He wanted to run ultrasonic testing at specific frequency ranges, wanted to examine bond lines between structural elements, wanted permission to delay Kane's departure another 8 hours for investigation that might reveal nothing or might save lives. The request landed badly. Diana had already burned political capital on morning delays, had watched stock price tumble on news of safety concerns, had fielded calls from board members who questioned whether her caution represented prudence or incompetence. Preston Vale had made his position clear during emergency conference call. Every hour of delay costs Skyline credibility and money in roughly equal measure. And if Kane walked away from this merger, the company's future became speculation rather than certainty. She told Garrett the truth without sugarcoating, explained that she'd reached the limit of delays she could authorize without board override, that his instincts might be correct, but institutional tolerance for following hunches had expired. Alexander Kane would board this aircraft at 6 a.m. tomorrow, or Skyline would lose the merger and probably the CEO who'd bet everything on a janitor's ears. The math was brutal, but undeniable. Garrett accepted the decision without argument, understood that organizations had constraints beyond technical considerations, knew that he'd exhausted Diana's ability to shield him from bureaucratic reality. He started walking toward his truck, toward Natalie, who'd been remarkably patient through 6 hours of crisis management, toward the small, safe life he'd built as alternative to this kind of high-stakes judgment. But the wrongness in that tail section wouldn't release its hold on his attention, kept pulling his focus back across 200 yards of tarmac to aircraft that might be fine or might be catastrophically flawed. Colonel Rutherford intercepted him in the parking lot shade, blocking the F-250's driver door with presence that demanded conversation rather than escape. The older man's voice carried weight earned through decades of making calls where wrong answers got people killed, where certainty was luxury and best available judgment had to suffice. You're walking away from something unfinished, son. I can see it eating at you from here. The observation was accurate enough to sting. Garrett leaned against the truck's sun-heated metal, felt it burn through shirt fabric, welcomed the distraction of minor physical discomfort from major emotional conflict. He explained about the tail section's resonance, about structural concerns that couldn't be proven without testing Diana wouldn't authorize, about being right versus being heard, versus being able to save people who wouldn't know they needed saving until metal failed at altitude. Rutherford's response came from experience that included losing his son to preventable mechanical failure 25 years earlier. Watching investigation reports confirm that warning signs had been dismissed as overcautious, living with knowledge that institutional inertia killed as effectively as enemy fire. He pointed out that Garrett had two choices: accept that his responsibility ended where authority did, or find ways to exercise judgment even without formal permission. The suggestion felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. Garrett asked what the colonel meant specifically, got answer that involved voluntary overtime and independent inspection and documenting findings, whether or not anyone wanted to see them. Cover your ass engineering taken to logical extreme, creating paper trail that would protect against liability if disaster struck, providing ammunition for lawsuits or investigations that only mattered after people died. The cynicism made Garrett's stomach turn, but Natalie's voice cut through ethical complexity with 8-year-old directness. She'd walked over from the employee lounge, bored with coloring books and curious about why Daddy was taking so long. Her question came innocent and devastating. "Are you going to let them fly the broken airplane?" Children had gift for reducing complicated situations to essential truth. The airplane wasn't broken in ways that sensors could detect or regulations would prohibit, but it carried stresses that Garrett's experience recognized as precursor to catastrophic failure. Letting it fly meant accepting that his judgment might be wrong, that institutional constraints mattered more than individual concern, that keeping his job and his daughter safe justified silence about risks he couldn't prove. Refusing to let it fly meant confronting Deanna again, pushing back against authority that had already granted him extraordinary latitude, potentially destroying the tentative bridge they'd built through shared crisis. It meant choosing principle over pragmatism, conscience over career security, the kind of decision that felt noble in abstract but messy in execution. Garrett made the choice Catherine would have made, the one that honored her memory better than hiding did. He told Natalie to wait in the truck's air conditioning, told Rutherford he'd need backup if this went wrong, walked back into the hangar with determination that felt equal parts courage and stupidity. Diana was in her office managing the controlled chaos of rescheduled logistics and board relations, trying to salvage merger timeline while maintaining safety margins. She looked up from her laptop when Garrett knocked, expressions cycling through surprise and concern and preemptive frustration. Before she could ask, he laid out his case with precision that came from having argued technical concerns to skeptical superiors for 2 decades. The tail spar needed ultrasonic inspection at 47 kilohertz, specifically targeting composite bond lines in the vertical stabilizer root structure, looking for delamination that X-ray imaging would miss because the failure mode involved separation between carbon fiber layers rather than breaks in individual fibers. Diana's exhaustion showed through professional composure, like cracks in poorly maintained pavement. She'd already fought this battle, already explained that delays were impossible, already made peace with flying an aircraft that every sensor said was airworthy. Garrett pushing for more testing felt less like safety advocacy and more like inability to accept institutional constraints. Her words came sharp with accumulated stress. The plane was certified, the inspections were complete. The testing showed green across every parameter that FAA regulations required. If Garrett had specific evidence of failure rather than just feeling something was wrong, she'd listen. But hunches weren't enough to justify destroying what remained of Skyline's credibility with the merger partner who'd already demonstrated remarkable patience. The confrontation attracted attention from engineering teams still working on final pre-flight checks. Julian approached with tablets showing comprehensive structural analysis, acoustic testing, and thermal imaging, all confirming airframe integrity within manufacturer specifications. His tone carried less condescension than morning's encounter, but still suggested that Garrett's concerns reflected overcaution rather than legitimate technical insight. "Every test we can run says this aircraft is safe. What specific evidence suggests otherwise beyond your subjective impression?" The question was fair in ways that made it harder to answer. Garrett had no sensor data supporting his concern, no visible cracks or measurable deviations from baseline performance. What he had was pattern recognition born from seeing failures that looked fine until they weren't, muscle memory of placing hands on surfaces and feeling wrongness. Years of learning that catastrophic problems often announce themselves through whispers before screams. But articulating intuition to engineers trained in empirical methodology was like explaining color to someone who'd only known grayscale. The language didn't translate, the evidence couldn't be quantified, the certainty felt absolute, but remained unprovable. Garrett stood in the middle of Diana's office, surrounded by people demanding data he couldn't provide, facing dismissal that was professionally justified even while being potentially fatal. Natalie appeared in the doorway, insulin pump visible under her sweater, glucose monitor in hand showing levels that required snack within 20 minutes. She disobeyed instructions to wait in the truck, had followed her father because 8 years of watching him had taught her that sometimes grown-ups needed children to remind them what mattered. Her presence shifted the room's energy from technical debate to something more fundamentally human. Diana saw the little girl who believed absolutely in her father's judgment, who'd grown up watching him make decisions that kept her alive through medical condition that required constant vigilance, who trusted that Daddy heard things other people missed because experience had proven that trust warranted. The CEO, who'd spent 6 months trying to earn respect from men who doubted her competence, recognized something familiar in child's faith in parents' expertise. She made a decision that would define her tenure as profoundly as hiring the janitor had. Choice that balanced institutional pressure against individual conscience, organizational needs against personal conviction. Her voice carried finality that precluded argument. We're doing the ultrasonic testing. 47 kilohertz on tailspar composite bonds. If it shows clean, cane boards tomorrow and we never speak of this again. If it shows problems, we ground the fleet and deal with consequences. Julian, set it up. The engineering team exchanged glances that communicated volumes about professional hierarchy being inverted, about CEO trusting maintenance worker over graduate-level analysis, about the uncomfortable reality that expertise sometimes resided in unexpected places. Julian's jaw tightened, but his hands moved to configure testing equipment, because arguing with direct orders from the CEO was career-limiting regardless of technical justification. Ultrasonic testing at specific frequencies required specialized equipment that Skyline's maintenance facility possessed, but rarely deployed for routine inspections. The transducer array connected to processing unit that would translate acoustic reflections into visual representation of internal structure, showing bond integrity through color-coded imaging that made invisible problems visible. Setup required 30 minutes while Kane's arrival countdown continued its relentless march towards 6 a.m. deadline. Garrett stood aside during preparation, watching technicians position sensors and calibrate frequencies, feeling the weight of being right versus being wrong, with stakes measured in lives and livelihoods. If the testing showed nothing, he'd look like paranoid amateur who'd wasted everyone's time and Diana's political capital on phantom concerns. If it showed delamination, 12 people wouldn't die tomorrow, but Skyline's reputation would suffer damage that might prove terminal. The afternoon stretched toward evening, Phoenix heat finally relenting as sunset approached. Hangar lights supplementing natural illumination as work continued past normal business hours. Natalie sat in employee lounge with snack provided by sympathetic administrative assistant, coloring pictures of airplanes that would never carry the complexity of real aircraft but captured essential beauty that kept her father committed to getting them right. Testing began with systematic sweep of vertical stabilizers' primary structural members, ultrasonic waves penetrating composite layering and bouncing back with information about density variations and bond integrity. The first 3 sections showed green, perfect adhesion between carbon fiber layers, no signs of stress concentration or delamination. Julian's expression suggested vindication, confirmation that elaborate testing was revealing exactly what conventional inspection had already established. The 4th section, deep in the root junction where vertical stabilizer connected to fuselage, showed different story. Red bands appeared on display screen indicating separation between composite layers, delamination that had progressed far enough to compromise structural integrity while remaining invisible to surface inspection. The failure zone extended across 8 inches of critical load path, would have held under normal flight conditions, but would catastrophically fail under high G loads from severe turbulence or aggressive maneuvering. The technician running the test went silent, adjusting parameters to confirm the reading wasn't instrument error, running the scan 3 more times to verify that red meant what red always meant in structural analysis. Julian leaned closer to the screen, face draining color as implication registered. Flight path to Singapore crossed tropical weather systems, forecasts showing convective activity that would generate turbulence, requiring load factors between 2 and 3 Gs to navigate safely. Diana's voice came quiet and controlled, CEO mask firmly in place despite internal reaction that probably included terror and relief in unstable mixture. She wanted to know probability of failure, wanted numbers she could report to board members and regulators and merger partners, wanted quantification of the disaster Garrett had prevented. Julian ran calculations using structural engineering software that modeled composite failure under dynamic loading. The results came back unambiguous and damning. At 2.3 G load, probability of catastrophic tail separation exceeded 87%. The aircraft would have torn itself apart over Pacific Ocean, killed everyone aboard, triggered investigation that would reveal the delamination Skyline's conventional inspection had missed. The hangar went silent except for cooling fans and diagnostic equipment and distant sound of Phoenix traffic beyond facility perimeter. 10 engineers who'd started the day confident in their methodologies now confronted evidence that their confidence had been misplaced, that the janitor they dismissed had seen catastrophic failure they'd certified as safe, that professional credentials mattered less than practical wisdom when lives hung in balance. Rutherford's voice broke the silence with military directness that cut through shock and recrimination. He pointed out that they'd found the problem before anyone died, that Garrett's persistence had saved 12 lives, and probably Skyline's corporate existence, that the appropriate response was gratitude rather than embarrassment. The colonel looked at Diana with expression that demanded acknowledgement of debt owed. Diana's response came without hesitation, loud enough for entire hangar to hear, clear enough that nobody could mistake her meaning. She thanked Garrett explicitly and specifically, acknowledged that his judgment had proven superior to institutional process, committed to implementing changes that would prevent future near misses. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She walked over to where Garrett stood near the testing equipment, extended her hand for handshake that had nothing to do with corporate protocol and everything to do with respect between equals. Her words came without prepared script or political calculation. You saved my company twice today. You saved 12 lives tonight. I will never make the mistake of dismissing you again. The handshake lasted 3 seconds, contact that transmitted acknowledgement and apology, and something that might become partnership if circumstances allowed. Natalie watched through glass partition with satisfaction that suggested she'd expected this outcome all along, that her faith in Daddy had never wavered because wavering wasn't in her vocabulary. But Alexander Kane's impending arrival created new crisis to replace the one just averted. Tailspar replacement required minimum 6 hours for parts procurement and installation, meant delaying departure from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. at earliest, meant another conversation with merger partner who'd already shown remarkable patience through morning's mechanical drama. Diana made the call herself, refusing to delegate difficult conversation to subordinates. Kane answered on second ring, voice sharp with irritation that softened when Diana explained the situation with unadorned honesty. Structural failure had been detected during enhanced inspection, would have resulted in catastrophic loss of aircraft over Pacific. Delay was necessary to preserve his life rather than her convenience. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Diana wondered if he'd hung up. When Kane spoke again, his tone had shifted from irritated client to impressed observer. He pointed out that most CEOs would have gambled on passing inspection results, would have prioritized schedule over safety, especially when sensors showed green, would have let him board an aircraft that might have killed him rather than admit to problems that reflected poorly on company competence. Diana's honesty had bought something more valuable than his business. His next words came through speakerphone loud enough for Hanger to hear, validation that mattered more than any board resolution or stock price recovery. He announced that the merger would proceed as planned. That delay was not only acceptable, but reassuring. That he wanted to meet the person who detected failure. Conventional inspection missed. When Diana explained that person was technically maintenance staff rather than engineering management, Kane's laughter carried genuine appreciation for institutional inversions. Ms. Ashford, I've built 14 companies across 4 industries. The best safety asset I ever encountered wore mechanics coveralls and got paid $12 an hour. Bring your maintenance genius to Singapore. I want him consulting on my fleet safety protocols. The offer hung in air like suspended possibility, opportunity that would pull Garrett back into professional contexts he'd abandoned 7 years earlier, that would require travel and responsibility and exposure to the kind of high-stakes judgment that had gotten Sterling killed. Diana looked at him with question in her eyes, offering chance to accept or decline without pressure beyond circumstance. Garrett's response came automatic and apologetic. He appreciated the offer, but had daughter who needed him home at 5:30 every evening for dinner and insulin management and homework help. Couldn't accept consulting work that required international travel or unpredictable schedules, had to decline, despite recognizing the professional opportunity being extended. Kane's voice came through speaker with understanding that suggested personal experience with priority calculations. He counteroffered immediately. 4-day work weeks, remote consultation on Fridays, unlimited healthcare coverage for Natalie's diabetes, including experimental treatments, and latest insulin pump technology, company housing in Phoenix to minimize commute time. Deal structured around Garrett's constraints rather than expecting him to accommodate corporate needs. The offer was generous enough to feel surreal, addressed every practical objection Garrett could raise, left him without easy excuse for refusing. He looked at Natalie through glass partition, saw her watching with expression that suggested she'd already made decision he was still contemplating. 8 years old and wiser than her father about when safety became cage rather than protection. Diana added her own argument, quieter and more personal than Kane's financial incentives. She pointed out that Garrett had saved lives today by refusing to stay silent, that expertise unused was expertise wasted, that Catherine's memory deserved better than husband who'd spent 7 years hiding from the work that gave his life meaning. The invocation of his dead wife felt manipulative and accurate in uncomfortable combination, but accepting meant acknowledging that he'd been wrong about how to honor Catherine's deathbed promise, that staying safe for Natalie had become excuse for staying small. That 7 years of invisibility had served fear more than love. It meant stepping back into professional contexts where his judgment would be tested and questioned, where being right wouldn't always mean being heard, where the ghosts of past failures would have to be confronted rather than avoided. Garrett asked for time to think, Got 24 hours before Kane needed answer. Used the window to deflect rather than decide. Tail spar replacement began immediately, with parts rush ordered from manufacturer, installation crew working overnight to meet revised departure schedule. Diana authorized overtime for entire team, catered dinner from restaurant that normally required reservations 3 weeks ahead, turned crisis management into collaborative effort rather than top-down directive. The evening stretched toward midnight with Garrett supervising structural work despite having no official authority to do so, offering technical guidance that Julian's team accepted without the morning's resistance, teaching through demonstration rather than lecture. Natalie fell asleep on employee lounge couch around 9 p.m., covered with jacket someone provided. Glucose levels stable enough that Garrett could focus on aircraft repair without constant medical monitoring. Diana brought coffee around 11, stood beside Garrett while composite bonding compound cured under heat lamps, talked about her father's approach to leadership and legacy and the weight of inherited expectations. She confessed that she'd spent 6 months trying to prove herself worthy of CEO title by mimicking Harrison Ashford's management style, had only recently realized that proving herself meant being herself rather than performing version of someone else. Garrett shared his own version of that insight, about how hiding from work that mattered hadn't honored Catherine's memory so much as betrayed it, how Natalie needed to see her father engaged with life rather than withdrawing from it, how safety and growth weren't mutually exclusive if approached with wisdom rather than fear. The conversation felt like therapy session neither had planned, honesty enabled by exhaustion and shared crisis. Around 1 a.m., with tailspar installation approaching completion and departure timeline stabilizing toward 2 p.m. tomorrow, Diana made offers she'd been formulating since afternoon's testing. Not chief safety officer with its bureaucratic constraints and political exposure, but technical advisor reporting directly to CEO with veto authority on flight operations, part-time schedule accommodating Natalie's needs, salary reflecting expertise rather than job title. The position would let Garrett exercise judgment without shouldering full management responsibility, would give him platform to prevent disasters without requiring him to navigate corporate politics, would honor his skills while respecting his constraints. Diana framed it less as job offer than as partnership between people who'd learned to trust each other's judgment through trial by fire. Garrett didn't accept immediately, asked what would happen when his judgment conflicted with board pressure or financial incentives or regulatory minimums, wanted to know whether Diana's support would survive beyond crisis that had forced it. Her answer came without hesitation or corporate hedging. I'd rather lose the company than lose my integrity. You taught me that today, multiple times. The words carried weight of commitment rather than platitude, promise that would be tested repeatedly if Garrett accepted. He looked at Natalie sleeping peacefully on the couch, at the aircraft being rebuilt to standards exceeding manufacturer specifications, at the team of engineers who'd learned humility alongside technical skills. He thought about Catherine's letter and Sterling's ghost and 7 years of choosing safety over meaning. His answer came quiet but definite. He'd take the position on trial basis, 3 months to determine whether partnership could survive beyond crisis that had forged it, with option to return to maintenance work if the arrangement proved unsustainable. Diana accepted the qualified commitment without pushing for more, recognized that trust built through crisis still needed time to solidify into something durable. The handshake sealing the agreement felt different from afternoon's gratitude, carried possibility and risk in equal measure, marked beginning of collaboration that would be tested in ways neither could predict. Rutherford witnessed the exchange from across the hangar, allowed himself small smile of satisfaction at having pushed both of them toward choices their caution would have avoided. Tailspar installation completed at 3 a.m. Testing confirmed integrity at 4. Final systems check showed green across all parameters by 5. Kane's revised departure sat 7 hours away, enough time for crew rest and final pre-flight inspection and the normal rhythms of aviation that didn't include finding catastrophic failures hours before scheduled takeoff. The overnight team dispersed toward homes and sleep, leaving Garrett and Diana and Rutherford alone in hangar that felt vast and quiet after days' sustained intensity. Natalie woke around 5:30, disoriented briefly until she saw her father and remembered where they were. Her first question was whether the airplane was fixed, whether the people would be safe now, whether Daddy had done what needed doing. Garrett confirmed all three, picked her up despite her protests that she was too old to be carried, held her with fierce gratitude for wisdom that had pushed him toward better choices. Diana watched the father-daughter moment with expression suggesting she understood something about Garrett she hadn't grasped before, about how his technical expertise was inseparable from his capacity to love, about how the man who could hear aircraft whisper their problems was the same man who monitored his daughter's glucose levels with obsessive precision. Both skills reflected same fundamental quality: attention powered by care rather than mere competence. The sunrise came gradual and beautiful, turning Phoenix sky from black to purple to orange to blue, washing the hangar in light that felt like benediction after night-sustained effort. Kane would arrive in 8 hours to board aircraft that was safer than when he'd first planned to fly it, would sign merger that would secure Skyline's future, would validate Diana's leadership and Garrett's return to meaningful work. But first, there was breakfast to buy for hungry daughter, insulin to administer, glucose to monitor, the small essential tasks that defined Garrett's life regardless of professional triumphs. He thanked Diana for the opportunity, confirmed he'd be back at noon for pre-departure walkthrough, loaded Natalie into the F-250 while she chattered about airplanes and engines and whether Daddy was famous now. Rutherford walked them to the parking lot, stood beside truck's driver door with expression that mixed pride and concern. He warned that the easy part was over, that proving competence in crisis was simpler than sustaining it through normal operations, that Garrett would face resistance from people invested in conventional approaches who'd resent his authority. The institutional battles would be harder than technical problems, politics more draining than engineering. Garrett acknowledged the warning without letting it change his decision, pointed out that he'd faced worse challenges than corporate resistance, that Catherine's death and Sterling's ghost had prepared him for difficulties that made bureaucratic friction seem manageable. He drove toward home with daughter beside him, toward 3 hours of sleep before returning to work that felt like purpose again. 3 hours of sleep felt inadequate but necessary, stolen time between midnight crisis and noon accountability. Garrett woke to Natalie's alarm at 9 a.m., her glucose monitor chirping its routine demand for attention, insulin pump requiring cartridge replacement and site rotation. The morning rituals grounded him after night's sustained intensity, reminded him that professional triumphs mattered less than keeping this 8-year-old alive and thriving through medical condition that required constant vigilance. Breakfast was scrambled eggs and precisely measured carbohydrates, orange juice portioned to 15 grams exactly, calculation that had become second nature over 2 years of diabetes management. Natalie talked about the airplane and the engineers and whether Daddy was going to wear a suit now instead of coveralls. Her excitement carried innocence that hadn't yet learned how quickly institutional support could evaporate when crisis faded into hindsight. The Phoenix Morning News played on the kitchen television, background noise Garrett usually ignored while preparing Natalie's school lunch. But his name cut through domestic routine with jarring clarity, spoken by anchor whose polished delivery couldn't disguise the scandal-mongering underneath. The story had broken overnight through channels Garrett couldn't trace, leaked by someone with access to internal communications and agenda that didn't align with celebrating crisis averted. The headline framed disaster as incompetence rather than near miss, positioned Skyline Aviation as company whose engineering team had missed catastrophic structural failure that required Janitor to detect. The implication dripped through every carefully chosen word. If maintenance staff could find problems graduate engineers missed, what other failures lurked undetected in Skyline's fleet? The reporter interviewed aviation safety expert who questioned whether this incident represented isolated oversight or systemic negligence, whether passengers should trust airline whose quality control had proven so dramatically inadequate. Garrett's phone buzzed with text from Diana, brief message that managed to communicate exhaustion and frustration in equal measure. Board had called emergency meeting for 10 a.m. Media inquiries were flooding corporate communications. Stock price had dropped another 12% in pre-market trading. She needed him at Skyline immediately, needed unified message before board members seized narrative to force her resignation. The drive to the facility took 20 minutes through Phoenix traffic that felt heavier than usual, as if entire city had decided simultaneously that Thursday morning required urgent travel. Natalie sat beside him in passenger seat, excused from school by father's promise to deliver her to campus by noon, regardless of work complications. She asked questions about why people were saying mean things about the company Daddy had helped, why saving lives was being reported as embarrassment instead of achievement. Garrett explained as best he could about institutional politics and narrative control, about how organizations sometimes preferred looking competent over being safe, about the way truth got distorted when filtered through people who cared more about reputation than reality. The explanation felt inadequate even as he gave it. Adult cynicism that 8-year-olds shouldn't need to understand but often absorbed anyway through observation. Skyline's parking lot contained 3 news vans by the time Garrett arrived. Reporters and camera operators positioned near main entrance, hoping to catch employees for impromptu interviews. He parked in the service area, used badge that still read maintenance technician to access through rear door, avoided media circus that would reduce yesterday's technical achievement to soundbite controversy. Diana's office had transformed into war room, walls covered with printouts of news articles and social media posts, laptop screens showing real-time stock price decline, and message boards where anonymous commenters speculated about Skyline's imminent bankruptcy. The CEO looked like she'd aged 5 years overnight, professional armor showing cracks that exhaustion made impossible to hide. She briefed Garrett on board dynamics with brutal efficiency. Preston Vale had spent early morning calling directors individually, building coalition around argument that Diana's leadership represented unacceptable risk, that hiring Janitor as safety advisor demonstrated judgment too impaired to trust with corporate future. 7 board members had indicated support for no confidence vote, enough to force her resignation if motion reached formal ballot. The attack wasn't about safety protocols or engineering competence, was naked power play by chairmen who'd opposed Diana's appointment from beginning, who'd tolerated her tenure only while quarterly numbers stayed positive, who saw media crisis as opportunity to install CEO more aligned with his vision. Vale's preferred replacement was already being discussed in back channels, executive from Atlas Aviation who'd promised more aggressive cost-cutting and less accommodation of employee concerns. Garrett asked what Diana needed from him, got answer that involved joint press conference at 11 a.m., presentation to board immediately following, unified message about enhanced safety protocols and commitment to technical excellence. She drafted talking points that positioned yesterday's events as validation of Skyline's thoroughness rather than evidence of systemic failure, spun crisis into competitive advantage through emphasis on going beyond regulatory minimums. The strategy felt reasonable until Garrett read the specific language Diana proposed. The narrative erased his role almost completely, credited engineering team's diligence rather than maintenance technicians' expertise, avoided mentioning that conventional inspection had missed catastrophic failure. The omission was politically calculated and factually dishonest, protected institutional reputation by sacrificing individual accuracy. Diana saw his expression shift, understood his objection before he articulated it. Her explanation came weary and apologetic, acknowledged the dishonesty while defending its necessity. Board members wouldn't accept story that made their expensive engineering team look incompetent. Media would seize on Janitor Saves Airline angle to question every aspect of Skyline's operations. Customers would flee to competitors if narrative suggested safety depended on luck rather than systematic process. Garrett's response came quiet but absolute. He wouldn't participate in press conference that required lying about what happened, wouldn't validate institutional face-saving that erased the lessons yesterday should have taught. If Diana needed him gone to protect her position, he'd resign immediately and return to maintenance work, but he wouldn't compromise truth to serve political convenience. The ultimatum landed badly in room already tense with accumulated crisis. Diana's frustration finally broke through professional control, voice rising to volume that carried through closed office door to administrative assistants outside. You think this is about my convenience? This is about saving 1,200 jobs, about keeping airline operational so families can pay mortgages and kids can go to college. Your principles are admirable, but they're luxury when hundreds of people depend on this company surviving. Sometimes adults have to make compromises children don't understand. The words hit harder than Diana probably intended, crossed line from professional disagreement into personal attack. Garrett stood to leave, decided that partnership forged in crisis couldn't survive first test of institutional pressure, that Catherine had been right about systems valuing conformity over conscience. But Natalie's voice stopped him halfway to door. She'd been sitting quietly in corner of office, coloring picture of airplane, while grown-ups discussed things she wasn't supposed to understand but clearly did. Her question came with devastating simplicity that cut through political calculation to essential truth. Miss Diana, if you lie about Daddy fixing the airplane, how will people know to listen when airplanes need help? 8-year-old logic had gift for exposing adult sophistication as elaborate rationalization. Diana went silent, stared at child who'd asked question that dismantled her entire communication strategy, that reminded her of principles she'd claimed to value before board pressure made abandoning them seem pragmatic. The CEO who'd built career on calculated image management confronted reality that sometimes truth mattered more than optics. Her response came after long pause, voice stripped of defensive anger, honest about conflict between what she knew was right and what she believed was necessary. She told Natalie that grown-ups sometimes got confused about important things, that fear of consequences made them choose safety over honesty, that being leader was harder than just being good person because leaders carried responsibility for everyone depending on them. Garrett watched Diana struggle with admission that felt like surrender, saw a woman who'd inherited impossible position trying to navigate between competing obligations. He thought about Sterling's death, and how institutional pressure to stay on schedule had overridden safety concerns, about how Catherine had begged him to leave systems that valued efficiency over lives, about the 7 years he'd spent hiding rather than fighting because fighting had proven so consistently futile. But he also thought about Natalie learning from this moment what compromises were acceptable, what principles could be abandoned when pressure increased, what kind of person her father chose to be when choosing had consequences. The decision crystallized with clarity that felt like relief despite its difficulty. He told Diana he'd participate in press conference on one condition. They told the truth completely and accurately, acknowledged that conventional inspection had failed and unconventional expertise had succeeded, accepted whatever media and board reaction followed from honesty. If that cost Diana her job, he'd testify on her behalf that she'd made every right choice under impossible circumstances, but he wouldn't lie. The board meeting convened at 10 a.m. in conference room, designed to intimidate through scale and expensive materials, 20-foot ceilings and mahogany table that could seat 30 directors and their advisors. Preston Vale presided from head of table with satisfaction barely concealed behind concern trolling about Skyline's future. Positioned Diana's tenure as failed experiment that needed termination before more damage accumulated. The chairman opened with prepared remarks reviewing Skyline's declining stock price, media coverage framing company as negligent, customer service reports showing increased cancellation requests and route changes. He presented Diana's leadership as fundamentally flawed, argued that her decision to empower maintenance technician demonstrated judgment too erratic to trust, suggested that board had obligation to shareholders and employees to install more reliable executive. 7 directors nodded agreement. Coalition Vale had assembled through morning phone calls and promises about future direction. 4 remained non-committal, waiting to hear Diana's defense before choosing sides. 1 director was conspicuously absent, emergency in Denver that removed potential Diana supporter from critical vote. Diana presented without notes, spoke directly about yesterday's events with precision that left no room for spin or interpretation. She acknowledged that conventional inspection had missed structural failure, that maintenance technician with military aerospace background had detected problem through methods engineering team hadn't employed, that she'd authorized unconventional testing over objections from senior staff. She took full responsibility for outcomes good and bad, defended decisions that had prevented catastrophic loss of aircraft and lives. Vale interrupted before Diana could finish, suggested that her account actually strengthened case for removal. If engineering team was incompetent enough to miss obvious failures, if safety depended on lucky intervention from Janitor, if established protocols were inadequate, then leadership that had built and maintained those systems deserved replacement. The logic was circular but effective, turned Diana's honesty into evidence of her own inadequacy. Garrett sat beside Diana at conference table, present but silent until Vale dismissed his expertise with casual contempt that finally pushed him past restraint. The chairman characterized yesterday's events as fortunate coincidence, suggested that maintenance workers' diagnosis was educated, guess that happened to prove correct, argued that basing safety protocols on individual intuition rather than systematic process represented dangerous precedent. The assessment was factually wrong and professionally insulting in ways that Garrett had tolerated for 7 years, but couldn't accept when lives and principles were at stake. He spoke without permission, voice carrying authority that came from 20 years of expertise rather than position in corporate hierarchy. Mr. Vale, with respect, you're wrong about almost everything you just said. What happened yesterday wasn't lucky coincidence. It was recognition of failure mode that sensors missed because they're not designed to detect mechanical resistance, only electrical signal transmission. The engineering team isn't incompetent. They're limited by tools and training that emphasize data over observation. And Ms. Ashford's decision to authorize unconventional testing despite board pressure and timeline constraints was exactly the kind of leadership that prevents disasters instead of investigating them afterward. The room went silent with tension that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. Vale's expression cycled through surprise to anger to calculation, recognized that attacking Garrett directly would validate Diana's decision to trust him, that dismissing military veteran as mere janitor would play poorly in media already scrutinizing Skyline's judgment. The chairman shifted tactics with smooth precision. He suggested that Garrett's expertise, however impressive, represented individual capability rather than scalable solution, that Skyline needed systematic improvements rather than dependence on single-person skills, that Diana's failure was creating processes that would prevent future near misses without requiring heroic intervention. The criticism was sophisticated enough to sound reasonable while still positioning Diana's leadership as inadequate. Colonel Rutherford spoke from back of conference room, where he'd been observing as safety advisor invited specifically to provide independent perspective. His voice carried weight earned through 40 years of military service and aviation expertise that predated everyone in the room by decades. Mr. Chairman, I've spent my career around aircraft and the people who keep them flying. The best safety systems I've seen combined rigorous process with human judgment, used sensors to augment expertise rather than replace it. Mrs. Ashford built that system yesterday under crisis conditions. Most CEOs would have prioritized schedule over safety, would have trusted green lights on screens rather than concerns from maintenance worker. She chose differently, and 12 people are alive because of it. The endorsement from outside experts shifted room dynamics, gave Diana supporters argument that wasn't contaminated by employment relationship or political loyalty. Two uncommitted directors leaned forward with renewed attention, began asking questions about specific protocols and implementation timeline, rather than accepting Vail's characterization that yesterday represented failure rather than success. But the chairman had prepared for resistance, produced analysis from Atlas Aviation Consultant suggesting that Skyline's near miss indicated broader quality control failures, that responsible board governance required leadership change to restore customer confidence. The report included recommendations for immediate actions: CEO replacement, engineering team restructuring, return to conventional inspection protocols that were industry standard and legally defensible. Diana recognized the document as pre-planned attack rather than good faith analysis, saw that Vail had been coordinating with competitors to engineer her removal regardless of yesterday's events. The media leaks, the consultant's convenient availability, the timing of the board meeting itself, all suggested orchestration designed to exploit crisis rather than resolve it. She called the conspiracy explicitly, pointed out that Atlas Aviation's consultant had financial incentive to recommend changes that would benefit his employer, that Vail's rush to judgment suggested agenda unrelated to Skyline's actual performance. The accusation was bold enough to shift several directors' expressions from neutral to concerned, planted doubt about chairman's motivations that would complicate his coalition. But Vail dismissed the conspiracy theory as desperate deflection, called for immediate vote on no confidence resolution, forced confrontation that would determine Diana's future and Skyline's direction. 7 directors signaled support for the motion, 4 opposed, 1 absent, 1 undecided. The chairman needed 1 more vote to achieve majority required for CEO removal. The undecided director was Margaret Hastings, retired Air Force general who joined Skyline's board 2 years earlier at Harrison Ashford's personal request. She'd remained silent through morning's debate, taking notes and observing dynamics without revealing position. Now she asked Garrett direct question that would determine her vote. Mr. Brennan, in your professional opinion, does Skyline Aviation's current leadership represent acceptable stewardship of passenger safety? The answer would save or end Diana's tenure, would validate or repudiate the partnership they'd forged through crisis, would demonstrate whether Garrett's principles extended to political risk or stopped when personal consequences escalated. He thought about Catherine's letter and Sterling's ghost, and Natalie watching from Diana's office where she'd been told to wait during board meeting. His response came without hesitation or political calculation. Honesty that might cost Diana her job, but wouldn't compromise truth for convenience. General Hastings, Ms. Ashford made decisions yesterday that most CEOs wouldn't have the courage to make. She trusted judgment over data when they conflicted. She prioritized safety over schedule despite enormous pressure. She admitted uncertainty rather than projecting false confidence. Those are exactly the leadership qualities that prevent disasters. If this board removes her for demonstrating them, you're guaranteeing that future leaders will make opposite choices. Margaret Hastings nodded slowly, made decision that would be documented in meeting minutes and analyzed by business schools for years to come. She announced opposition to no confidence motion, argued that Diana's performance under crisis validated rather than questioned her leadership, suggested that board's role was supporting CEO who'd proven judgment under pressure rather than replacing her for political convenience. The vote failed 6-5, coalition insufficient for removal, but strong enough to signal ongoing opposition. Vale accepted the defeat with grace that barely concealed fury, promised continued scrutiny and accountability measures that would constrain Diana's authority going forward. The meeting adjourned with relationships damaged and fault lines exposed, victory that felt Pyrrhic given the institutional resistance it had revealed. Diana and Garrett retreated to her office where Natalie had fallen asleep on couch, exhausted by morning's sustained stress and glucose fluctuations that required constant adjustment. The CEO collapsed into chair behind her desk, professional armor finally dissolving completely, showed vulnerability she couldn't afford to display in conference room. Her voice came barely above whisper, drained of energy that had sustained her through crisis after crisis. She questioned whether saving her job was worth the political capital it had consumed, whether Garrett's support had damaged his own credibility beyond repair, whether partnership forged in extremity could survive normal operations, where dramatic rescues gave way to bureaucratic grinding. Garrett had no reassuring answers, acknowledged that institutional resistance would intensify rather than diminish, that Vale would use every future setback to argue for leadership change, that yesterday's triumph had bought time rather than security. But he also pointed out that they'd accomplished something worth protecting, had demonstrated that organizations could choose safety over convenience when leaders had courage to do so. The conversation was interrupted by text from Alexander Kane, brief message that Monday's merger signing would proceed as scheduled despite media turbulence, that he'd watched board meeting coverage on Bloomberg and been impressed by Diana's integrity under pressure. The validation from outside stakeholder who represented company's financial future provided anchor that internal politics had undermined. But Garrett's phone buzzed with different kind of message, call from Natalie's school nurse, reporting that her teacher had noticed unusual fatigue and requested glucose check. The reading came back at 240, hyperglycemic episode that required immediate insulin correction and close monitoring, complication that meant pulling her from school early and canceling afternoon's planned activities. The reminder of medical reality grounded Garrett's attention back to priorities that transcended corporate drama. He told Diana he needed to leave immediately, would return for afternoon press conference if Natalie's levels stabilized, couldn't make promises about availability when daughter's health demanded attention. She waved him away with understanding that came from recognizing that some obligations superseded employment. The drive to Natalie's school took 12 minutes through Phoenix midday traffic, insulin pump adjustment administered in school nurse's office, carbohydrate calculation to bring glucose back to target range without triggering reactive hypoglycemia. The medical choreography required focus that pushed board meeting stress into background, reminded Garrett that his primary identity was father rather than aerospace consultant, that professional validation mattered less than keeping this 8-year-old safe and stable. Natalie's voice came small and apologetic from passenger seat during drive home, blamed herself for numbers going high because she'd been stressed about Daddy and Miss Diana and whether people were going to be mean. Garrett assured her that diabetes was disease, not moral failing, that blood sugar didn't respond to good intentions or careful behavior, that she bore no responsibility for physiological processes beyond her control. But her next question cut deeper. Asked what Garrett himself had been avoiding through morning sustained intensity. If trying to help people made them mad and caused problems, why not just stay quiet and safe like before? The 8-year-old logic saw a pattern that adult rationalization tried to deny. Speaking truth created conflict. Conflict threatened security. Maybe invisibility had been wiser choice than engagement. Garrett pulled into their driveway before answering, needed full attention for response that would shape his daughter's understanding of courage and integrity, and when safety became cowardice. He explained as honestly as he could about how hiding felt safe, but actually meant letting other people make decisions that affected everyone, about how staying silent when you knew truth was its own kind of harm, about how Catherine would have wanted them to live fully rather than safely. The invocation of her mother carried authority that Garrett's own arguments lacked, reminded Natalie of women she barely remembered but whose presence still shaped their choices. She asked what Mommy would think about yesterday and today, whether she'd be proud or scared or angry about Daddy getting involved in complicated grown-up problems. The question unlocked memory Garrett had been avoiding since yesterday's crisis, Catherine's letter that he'd read at 3 a.m. while tail spar replacement proceeded and sleep remained impossible. He'd brought the letter home but hadn't shared it with Natalie, hadn't known whether 8 was old enough to handle dead mother's words, whether reading it aloud would provide comfort or create new grief. But Catherine had written the letter for exactly this kind of moment. For times when courage faltered and easy paths beckoned and choosing right over safe required reinforcement. Garrett retrieved the envelope from his bedroom, sat beside Natalie on living room couch, read words that wife had written knowing she wouldn't survive to speak them directly. The letter began with acknowledgement of fear Catherine knew would paralyze Garrett after her death, recognized that losing Sterling and then her would make safety seem like only rational response to a world that kept taking people he loved. But she challenged the premise that hiding protected anyone, argued that safety without purpose was just slow death, that Natalie deserved father who engaged with life rather than withdrew from it. Catherine's words spoke directly to current crisis with precision that suggested she'd known exactly what choices Garrett would face, what temptations would pull him toward invisibility, what arguments he'd use to justify retreat. She reminded him that Sterling had died not because Garrett's judgment was wrong, but because systems ignored it, that honoring that death meant fighting to make those systems better rather than accepting their brokenness. Wahi, the letter's final paragraph addressed Natalie directly. Mother's voice reaching across death to daughter who would grow up without her. Catherine wrote about listening and courage and the importance of speaking truth, even when staying silent was easier, about how the people who changed things were usually the ones willing to be uncomfortable, about how she hoped Natalie would choose her father's integrity over his fear. Garrett's voice broke reading the conclusion, grief that 7 years hadn't diminished hitting fresh and immediate. Natalie wrapped her arms around him with fierce protectiveness, told him that Mommy was right and they should listen to her, that being brave was scary but important, that she believed in Daddy even when he didn't believe in himself. The moment of connection was interrupted by knock on front door, unexpected visitor in middle of afternoon when normal rhythm called for quiet recovery from morning's intensity. Diana stood on the doorstep looking simultaneously professional and vulnerable, CEO armor discarded in favor of simple blouse and slacks that made her seem younger and more uncertain. She'd driven to their house to deliver news that couldn't wait for phone calls or text messages, that required face-to-face communication between people who'd earned that level of respect. The afternoon press conference had been canceled after emergency meeting with Vale. Compromise reached that would allow Diana to remain CEO, but required accepting oversight committee that would review major decisions, that would constrain her authority in ways that made yesterday's bold choices much harder to repeat. The arrangement felt like defeat disguised as compromise, institutional resistance reasserting control after a brief period when crisis had enabled exceptions. Diana acknowledged the outcome with exhaustion that suggested she understood the implications, that recognized she'd saved her title while losing much of her actual power. She came to Garrett's house to apologize for bringing him into a situation where speaking truth created complications, where partnership she'd offered was already being undermined by political realities she couldn't control. Garrett's response surprised them both, rejected apology in favor of commitment. He told Diana that oversight committees and political constraints were exactly why people like them needed to stay engaged rather than withdraw, that Vale's resistance proved they'd threatened something worth protecting, that Catherine's letter had reminded him that hard choices were worth making regardless of institutional pushback. The conversation continued in Garrett's modest living room, CEO and maintenance technician now partners in something larger than job titles, bound by shared commitment to principles that corporate politics tried to erode. Diana confessed her doubts about whether she had strength to sustain the fight, whether saving her position was worth the compromises it would require, whether resignation might be more honest response than accommodation. But Natalie's presence changed the calculus in ways adult reasoning couldn't quite capture. 8-year-old sitting between her father and the woman who'd believed in him reminded both adults that choices they made shaped more than their own futures, that principles demonstrated or abandoned would teach lessons beyond professional contexts. Diana looked at the girl whose mother's words had just challenged them both to courage, asked what Natalie thought she should do about job that was hard and people who were mean. The response came with clarity that adults had lost somewhere in accumulated cynicism and political sophistication. Mommy said important things are usually hard. If you stop because people are mean, then mean people win. That doesn't seem right. 8-year-old ethics had gift for exposing elaborate rationalization as simple cowardice. Diana laughed despite exhaustion, acknowledged that child's logic was more persuasive than any leadership consultant's advice, that sometimes wisdom came from unexpected sources if you were humble enough to listen. She thanked Natalie seriously and formally, promised to remember her counsel when political pressure made quitting seem easier than persisting. The afternoon stretched toward evening, with Diana staying longer than professional visit warranted, conversation ranging beyond corporate strategy to personal histories and shared vulnerabilities. Garrett learned about Diana's childhood, watching her father build company through mechanical competence and immigrant work ethic, about her mother's death when she was 12, and how Harrison had become both parents while running business that employed 2,000 people, about inheriting not just company, but impossible standard of excellence she'd spent her life trying to meet. Diana learned about Catherine's music and how she'd played piano with same precision Garrett brought to aerospace engineering, about Natalie's inheritance of perfect pitch that made her sensitive to sounds most people couldn't distinguish, about how disease and death had taught Garrett that control was illusion, but attention was choice. The exchange felt like foundation building for partnership that would need resilience to survive institutional resistance. Around 6 p.m., Garrett prepared dinner with practiced efficiency that came from 3 years of single parenting, chicken, and precisely measured rice and vegetables that Natalie's insulin dosing required calculation to match. Diana was invited to stay with casualness that suggested the offer mattered more than tone conveyed. Acceptance that felt like crossing threshold from professional alliance towards something closer to friendship. The meal conversation included Natalie's stories about school and friends and science project about sound waves that connected to her father's work in ways she found endlessly fascinating. Diana engaged with genuine interest, rather than polite tolerance, asked questions about how perfect pitch worked and what it meant to hear things differently, recognized that the child's capabilities weren't just cute trivia, but actual expertise worth respecting. After dinner, Garrett checked Natalie's glucose levels and administered insulin with routine that was simultaneously medical procedure and parental care. Demonstration of attention that kept his daughter alive through disease that killed people regularly. Diana watched with something like awe, recognized that the precision he brought to aircraft inspection was same precision that sustained Natalie's life, that his expertise was inseparable from his capacity to care deeply about consequences. The evening wound down toward Natalie's 8:30 bedtime. Ritual that Garrett maintained regardless of work complications or external pressures. Diana took the cue to leave, thanked them for hospitality and conversation that had reminded her why morning's fight had been worth fighting. At the door, she paused, turned back to ask Garrett whether he genuinely believed they could change Skyline's culture given Vale's resistance and Board's skepticism. His answer came without false optimism, but also without despair, acknowledged that changing institutions was generational work rather than immediate transformation, that victories would be partial and setbacks frequent, and success would look like incremental improvement rather than dramatic revolution. But he also pointed out that yesterday had proven change was possible when leaders had courage, that one prevented disaster justified years of effort, that Catherine's letter had reminded him that purpose mattered more than ease. Diana left with something between hope and determination, drove away from modest house in working-class Phoenix neighborhood that felt more grounded than corporate headquarters with its marble and steel and careful performance of excellence. The evening's final light caught her rearview mirror, turned the city into impressionistic blur of possibility and threat in unstable combination. Garrett put Natalie to bed with story about brave pilots and smart engineers, with reassurance that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but they'd face them together, with love that didn't require explanation or justification. After she fell asleep, he sat in living room with Catherine's letter, reading it again in quiet that felt like permission and challenge simultaneously. The letter's final line, the one he hadn't read aloud to Natalie, spoke directly to the choice he faced about staying engaged versus retreating to safety. Catherine wrote with certainty that felt like prophecy. The ghosts don't leave by hiding from them. They leave when you finally do the work they died trying to finish. Friday morning arrived with crystalline Arizona sky that promised turbulence-free flying. Temperature already climbing toward triple digits by 7 a.m. when Alexander Kane's motorcade pulled through Skyline Aviation's main gate. 3 black SUVs carrying tech mogul and his security detail, legal team prepared to finalize merger documents at 37,000 feet. Expectations calibrated by 2 days of mechanical drama that would have sent most executives fleeing toward competitors. Garrett had arrived at 5 a.m. for final pre-flight inspection, brought Natalie with him because school was canceled for teacher planning, and leaving her home alone was an option, regardless of professional obligations. She sat in employee lounge with homework and coloring books, glucose levels stable after overnight readings that had required 2 correction doses and 1 middle-of-night snack. The diabetes management had become background rhythm to their lives, constant calculation that continued regardless of whether Garrett was saving airlines or mopping floors. The Gulfstream sat in pristine hangar lighting, tailspar replacement completed to standards exceeding manufacturer specifications, every system tested and retested until Julian's engineering team ran out of protocols to follow. The aircraft represented $73 million of aerospace engineering that had nearly killed its passengers, that now stood as testament to what happened when institutions prioritized truth over convenience, when expertise was heard regardless of where it originated. Diana arrived 20 minutes before Kane, intercepted Garrett near the landing gear he was inspecting with attention that hadn't diminished despite night's sleep and morning's coffee. Her expression carried exhaustion that transcended physical tiredness, weight of board battle and media scrutiny, and institutional resistance that wouldn't disappear just because immediate crisis had passed. But underneath the fatigue lived determination that yesterday's fight had reinforced rather than depleted. She briefed Garrett on morning's agenda with military precision. Kane would tour the aircraft, receive technical explanation of repairs and safety enhancements, be offered opportunity to postpone flight if any concerns remained. Then departure at 8:30, 4-hour flight to Singapore, with merger signing scheduled over Pacific Ocean as symbolic gesture about partnership transcending borders. Media coverage would be extensive. Bloomberg and CNBC planning live updates. Investors watching to see whether Skyline's stock recovered or continued hemorrhaging value. The unspoken subtext was that this departure needed to be perfect, that any hesitation or complication would validate Vale's arguments about Diana's leadership, that Garrett's expertise was being tested not just technically, but institutionally. Success meant vindication for both of them. Failure meant resignations and restructuring and return to conventional protocols that prioritized credentials over competence. Kane emerged from lead SUV looking younger than his 52 years. Fitness that came from personal trainers and careful diet. Casual confidence of someone who'd built 14 successful companies and knew his own value. He greeted Diana with handshake that lasted exactly 3 seconds, professional warmth that communicated respect without false intimacy. Then he turned to Garrett with expression that mixed curiosity and assessment. The tech mogul's first words bypassed pleasantries in favor of directness that Garrett appreciated. He wanted to know specifically what had been wrong with the aircraft, what conventional inspection had missed, what made Garrett's diagnosis superior to methods that cost millions to develop and deploy. The questions came without condescension, genuine interest from someone who'd succeeded by recognizing expertise wherever it appeared. Garrett walked Kane through the technical details without dumbing them down or performing false modesty, explained about composite delamination and resonant frequencies and the difference between measuring electrical commands versus mechanical responses. He showed the replaced components under LED lighting that revealed microfractures invisible to naked eyes, demonstrated the ultrasonic testing that had confirmed structural failure conventional sensors missed. Kane absorbed the explanation with focus that suggested actual comprehension rather than polite attention, asked follow-up questions that indicated he'd done homework on aerospace engineering before trusting his life to this particular aircraft. The inspection lasted 40 minutes, covered every system Garrett had flagged or enhanced, ended with Kane's pronouncement that he felt safer boarding this plane than any commercial flight he'd taken in past decade. But the tech mogul's next move surprised everyone, including his own security team. He asked Diana to delay departure 30 minutes, requested that all engineers who'd worked on repairs assemble in hangar, announced intention to make statement before boarding. The spontaneous press conference violated carefully planned media strategy, created opportunity for complications that Diana's communications team scrambled to manage. Kane positioned himself near the Gulfstream's boarding stairs, 50 feet from aircraft that represented both near disaster and successful intervention, surrounded by engineers who'd spent 3 days learning humility alongside technical skills. Camera operators from news vans stationed outside got hurried permission to enter hangar, set up equipment with practice speed, went live to financial networks that interrupted regular programming for unexpected announcement from billionaire known for moving markets with casual comments. The tech mogul's statement began with acknowledgement that he'd nearly boarded fatally flawed aircraft 2 days earlier, that conventional safety protocols had failed to detect catastrophic structural problems, that only unconventional intervention had prevented disaster. He paused for emphasis, let the admission sink in for audience that included investors and competitors and regulators watching for evidence of negligence. Then Kane shifted narrative in direction nobody anticipated, praised Skyline's response rather than criticizing the initial failure, highlighted Diana's decision to authorize testing over engineering objections, emphasized Garrett's expertise that had been dismissed by institutional hierarchy until crisis forced recognition. The endorsement was unambiguous and powerful, coming from customer who had every reason to condemn but chose validation instead. His voice carried across hangar with authority that commanded attention without requiring volume. He spoke about how corporate culture either enabled or suppressed dissenting voices, about how most organizations punished people who challenged established protocols, about how Skyline had demonstrated rare willingness to admit uncertainty and accept expertise from unexpected sources. The observation was simultaneously compliment and critique, acknowledged progress while noting how exceptional it was. Kane's conclusion landed with force that would move stock prices and shape industry conversations for months. He announced not just that merger would proceed, but that it would expand, that he was increasing investment in Skyline by 40% specifically to fund safety initiatives, that he wanted Garrett consulting across his entire aviation portfolio at compensation reflecting expertise rather than job title. The financial commitment was substantial enough to offset yesterday's stock decline, strategic enough to validate Diana's leadership in ways board votes couldn't match. But Kane's final point addressed deeper issue than quarterly numbers or merger valuations, spoke to principle that had motivated his unscheduled statement. He looked directly at camera broadcasting live to financial networks, addressed audience that extended beyond hangars' immediate witnesses. The words came measured and deliberate, each phrase chosen for impact that would survive editing and soundbite extraction. Kane explained that he'd built career by recognizing that credentials predicted past performance, but judgment determined future outcomes, that expensive systems were tools not replacements for human expertise, that organizations succeeded by combining analytical rigor with practical wisdom. He paused, looked directly at Garrett. A wise man once told me, "Sensors can lie, but consequences never do." I'm investing 40% more in this company because they've proven they listen to consequences, not just sensors. He held up Skyline's response as model for how institutions should handle dissenting voices and uncomfortable truths. The endorsement from tech billionaire known for disrupting industries carried weight that Diana's own defense never could have achieved. Shifted narrative from crisis management failure to leadership under pressure success. Garrett watched Kane's performance with something between gratitude and discomfort, unused to being praised publicly after 7 years of deliberate invisibility, uncertain whether attention served principles or just substituted one kind of institutional pressure for another. But Natalie's presence in Employee Lounge reminded him that visibility had purpose beyond professional validation, that his daughter was learning lessons about courage and integrity from how adults responded to challenges, that modeling engagement mattered more than preserving comfort. She waved at him through glass partition, gave thumbs up that suggested she understood something important was happening, even if details remained opaque. Kane's statement concluded with invitation for questions from assembled media, calculated risk that his communications team would normally prevent, but that tech mogul's confidence rendered irrelevant. Reporters shouted queries about FAA investigation and potential fleet grounding and whether other airlines had similar undetected problems. Kane fielded them with diplomatic precision, defended Skyline without attacking competitors, praised regulatory oversight, while noting that rules created minimums rather than aspirations. One reporter asked a question that cut through technical discussion to human interest angle that would drive evening news coverage. She wanted to know how maintenance technician with no public profile had developed expertise that surpassed engineering team with advanced degrees, what Garrett's background was, and why he'd been working in relative obscurity. The question required answer that Garrett had been avoiding through 2 days of crisis, that would expose history he'd spent 7 years trying to leave behind, that would make Sterling's death and Catherine's illness part of public narrative he couldn't control. Diana looked at him with expression that communicated it was his choice whether to engage, that she'd deflect inquiry if he wanted privacy protected. But the letter Catherine had written specifically addressed this moment, had anticipated that hiding his past would eventually require either continued deception or uncomfortable honesty, had urged him to choose truth even when exposure felt threatening. Garrett stepped forward before Diana could intervene, positioned himself in camera frame beside Kane, spoke with voice that carried across hangar despite lack of microphone amplification. He explained about Air Force career and Sterling's death without dwelling on details that would sensationalize tragedy, acknowledged Catherine's illness and his choice to prioritize fatherhood over professional achievement, described 7 years of maintenance work as deliberate rather than defeat. The biography was compressed into 90 seconds that managed to convey essential facts without inviting pity or admiration, just statement of choices made and consequences accepted. The reporter's follow-up question felt inevitable and intrusive simultaneously. She asked whether Garrett regretted years spent in obscurity, whether he felt vindicated by recent recognition, whether he had advice for other experts whose talents were overlooked by credential-obsessed institutions. The inquiry invited philosophical reflection that would play well in human interest coverage but felt reductive compared to complexity of actual experience. Garrett's response bypassed the narrative journalist was constructing, refused to position himself as underdog vindicated or expertise finally recognized. He pointed out that obscurity had given him time with daughter that professional success would have consumed, that maintenance work had taught lessons about humility and attention that engineering management might have eroded, that the last 7 years were choice rather than exile regardless of how others might interpret them. But he acknowledged that Catherine's death had forced recognition that hiding served fear more than love, that Natalie deserved to see father engaged with work that mattered rather than withdrawn from it, that Sterling's ghost required honoring through action rather than avoidance. The candor was more than soundbite journalism usually accommodated, created moment of genuine vulnerability that resonated beyond typical press conference performance. Diana watched Garrett navigate media attention with grace she hadn't anticipated, saw a man who'd spent years invisible suddenly commanding room through quiet authority rather than self-promotion. She recognized opportunity to build on momentum Kane's endorsement had created, to announce initiatives she'd been developing overnight that would institutionalize lessons recent crisis had taught. She stepped to microphone with CEO confidence that recent battles had tested but not broken, addressed cameras broadcasting live to financial networks and aviation industry observers. Her announcement came without preamble or hedging, direct statement of policy that would define Skyline's future and challenge industry norms. Diana declared implementation of what she termed the Brennan Protocol, comprehensive safety enhancement that would require dual inspection for all aircraft, conventional sensor-based analysis plus human verification by experienced technicians trained to detect anomalies machines missed. The program would prioritize hiring former military aerospace specialists over recent graduates, would value practical expertise alongside theoretical knowledge, would create advancement paths for maintenance workers who demonstrated diagnostic capabilities regardless of formal credentials. The policy represented significant operational expense and cultural transformation, challenged industry trends toward automation and cost reduction, positioned Skyline as premium carrier willing to invest in safety beyond regulatory minimums. Diana acknowledged the financial implications without apologizing for them, argued that passenger trust was asset worth protecting through substantial investment, that preventing disasters was cheaper than investigating them. She announced Garrett's formal appointment as Chief Safety Officer with compensation reflecting expertise and authority to override engineering decisions when safety concerns warranted, made clear that maintenance technician who'd saved company was now senior executive with institutional power. The promotion was simultaneously recognition of individual achievement and commitment to systemic change, signal that Skyline valued results over resumes. But Diana's most significant announcement addressed industry beyond Skyline's immediate operations. She committed to sharing Brennan Protocol methodology with competitors and regulators, offered to provide training and consultation without charge, positioned safety enhancement as collaborative opportunity rather than competitive advantage. The generosity was strategically calculated to shape industry standards while building reputation for leadership, but also reflected genuine conviction that preventing disasters mattered more than market positioning. The press conference concluded with Kane boarding the Gulfstream, Diana accompanying him to finalize merger documents, aircraft departing into Phoenix morning with smooth professionalism that made recent drama seem distant. Garrett watched takeoff from hangar floor, tracking aircraft's climb with attention that wouldn't relax until confirmation of safe arrival in Singapore came hours later. Colonel Rutherford appeared beside him carrying coffee and observation that the last 48 hours had transformed more than just Garrett's employment status, had challenged institutional assumptions about expertise and hierarchy and whose voices deserved hearing. The older man's satisfaction was visible despite military training that usually suppressed emotional display. Recognition that principles he'd spent career defending had been validated through crisis that could easily have ended differently. The hangar emptied as morning shifted toward midday, engineers returning to normal operations that would feel different after recent lessons, media packing equipment, and filing stories that would drive evening news coverage. Garrett retrieved Natalie from Employee Lounge, found her completing math homework with focus that suggested she'd been largely oblivious to drama unfolding beyond glass partition. She asked whether the airplane had left safely, whether Daddy's work was finished now, whether they could go home and have normal Friday, like before all the excitement. The questions reflected 8-year-old's desire for routine that adult complications kept disrupting, reasonable wish for stability that Garrett shared despite recognition that recent changes had made old normal impossible to restore. He explained that work was never entirely finished when it involved keeping people safe, that new responsibilities meant schedule changes they'd need to navigate together, that nothing about their relationship or his commitment to her would diminish regardless of professional developments. The reassurance felt inadequate even as he offered it. Promise about maintaining balance that single parents knew was aspiration more than guarantee. But afternoon brought surprise that shifted conversation from obligations to possibilities. Alexander Kane's assistant called with formal offer that exceeded preliminary discussion. Chief safety consultant for Kane Industries' aviation portfolio, 4-day work weeks with Fridays remote, unlimited healthcare coverage for Natalie, including experimental treatments and latest continuous glucose monitoring technology, company housing allowance that would let them move from modest rental to actual owned home with yard and better schools. The compensation package was generous enough to transform their financial situation, addressed every practical concern Garrett had raised about accepting increased responsibility, removed obstacles that had made professional engagement seem incompatible with parenting obligations. Kane's assistant explained that offer reflected tech mogul's conviction that preventing disasters justified premium investment, that Garrett's expertise was worth whatever accommodation required to secure it. Garrett asked for a weekend to consider, got assurance that Monday deadline was flexible if more time was needed for decision with implications extending beyond professional context. He hung up feeling simultaneously grateful and overwhelmed, uncertain whether opportunity represented validation or trap, whether accepting meant honoring Catherine's memory or abandoning her deathbed, wish that he stay safe for Natalie. Evening found them at small Mexican restaurant near their house, booth and corner where Natalie could color while waiting for food, and Garrett could process day's developments without performance pressure. Diana joined them after receiving text invitation that acknowledged friendship emerging from professional alliance, brought appetite diminished by stress but willingness to celebrate survival through another crisis. The dinner conversation ranged across topics that had nothing to do with aviation or corporate politics, covered Natalie's science fair project and Diana's confession that she'd never learned to cook, and Garrett's admission that he missed piano music Catherine used to play. The ordinariness felt precious after days of sustained intensity, reminder that life consisted mostly of small moments rather than dramatic crises. But Natalie's question brought conversation back to decisions pending, asked whether Daddy was going to take the new job that paid lots of money and helped more people stay safe. Her framing revealed she'd been paying closer attention than adults assumed, had understood essential elements of offer despite financial details being beyond her comprehension. Garrett deflected with promise to discuss it over weekend, wanted time to think without 8-year-old's premature advocacy influencing judgment. But Diana's perspective offered insight that shifted his calculation, pointed out that opportunity to shape industry safety standards came rarely, that declining would leave field to people with less commitment or competence, that Catherine's letter had challenged him to do work Sterling's death left unfinished. The observation landed uncomfortably close to truth. Garrett had been avoiding that refusing Kane's offer would represent retreat disguised as prudence, that staying in newly created chief safety officer role at Skyline was safer choice than expanding influence across multiple companies and fleets. The distinction between reasonable caution and subtle cowardice was harder to identify than he wanted to admit. Rutherford appeared at their booth uninvited, pulled up chair with presumption that came from decades of military command and assumption that his perspective was welcome, regardless of whether invitation had been extended. The colonel ordered coffee and listened to abbreviated version of Kane's offer, absorbed details without interrupting, formulated response that addressed question Garrett hadn't articulated but needed answered. He pointed out that Sterling would have wanted his death to prevent other deaths, that the most meaningful memorial was expanding safety protocols beyond single incident, that influence over industry standards mattered more than comfort or financial security. The argument was emotionally manipulative and tactically effective, invoked ghost that haunted Garrett most persistently, challenged him to choose legacy over limitation. But Rutherford's final observation addressed Natalie directly, spoke to 8-year-old with respect usually reserved for adults. He told her that best gift parents could give children was modeling courage over comfort, showing them that meaningful work sometimes required sacrifice, demonstrating that principles were worth defending even when defense was difficult. The message was simultaneously for Natalie and Garrett. Reminder that choices they made taught lessons that extended beyond immediate consequences. The evening concluded with unspoken consensus that Garrett would accept Kane's offer, that partnership with Diana would expand rather than conclude, that invisibility was no longer option regardless of how appealing safety seemed. The decision felt inevitable and terrifying in equal measure. Commitment to engagement that couldn't be reversed once accepted. Choice that honored Catherine's memory while violating her explicit dying wish. Walking to truck and parking lot's warm darkness, Natalie's hand found Garrett's with unconscious trust that had survived every crisis and complication. She asked one final question with timing that suggested she'd been saving it for a moment of genuine curiosity rather than adult-dominated conversation. She wanted to know whether Mommy could see them from heaven, whether she knew about airplanes being fixed and people being saved, and Daddy not hiding anymore. The theology was beyond Garrett's capacity to address honestly, but the sentiment deserved response that honored both daughters' faith and wife's memory. He told Natalie that Catherine lived in choices they made and principles they defended and love that continued despite death, that heaven was less location than legacy, that Mommy saw them through their commitment to being people she'd believed they could become. The answer satisfied 8-year-old metaphysics while avoiding dishonesty about afterlife Garrett didn't believe in, but wouldn't deny to child seeking comfort. The Phoenix night wrapped around them with familiar warmth, city lights spreading toward mountains barely visible against dark sky. Ordinary Friday evening that marked end of extraordinary week and beginning of future neither could entirely predict. Garrett buckled Natalie into passenger seat, drove toward home with sense that Catherine's letter had been right about ghosts leaving when unfinished work finally got completed, that Sterling could rest easier knowing his death had catalyzed changes that would save lives he'd never meet. 8 months transformed landscape in ways that quarterly reports couldn't capture. Skyline Aviation's new headquarters wing bore brass lettering that read Brennan Safety Systems, division occupying what had been executive parking garage before Diana convinced board that investment and expertise mattered more than convenience for senior management. The reclaimed space now housed training facility where 40 engineers from Boeing, Airbus, and Embraer sat in classroom configuration normally reserved for university lecture halls, notebooks open, skepticism gradually dissolving as Garrett walked them through diagnostic methodology that combined sensor analysis with sensory observation. The salary from Kane Industries had transformed more than professional status. Garrett and Natalie had moved from their rental near the old neighborhood to a modest 3-bedroom house in North Scottsdale with a backyard where Catherine's piano finally had room to breathe, where Natalie could practice listening to wind chimes without neighbors complaining, where home meant stability earned through purpose rather than safety purchased through hiding. The mortgage felt like investment rather than burden, proof that engagement with life could provide security fear never had. His voice carried authority earned through results rather than credentials, teaching distilled from 20 years of listening to machines speak languages most technicians never learned. The rules he outlined weren't revolutionary in content, but radical in their assertion that expensive equipment served human judgment rather than replaced it, that attention powered by care detected failures, automation missed, that expertise resided wherever experience had taught hard lessons. Julian Cross stood at room's periphery, deputy director now instead of skeptical engineer, adding commentary that acknowledged his own transformation from credential worship to balanced appreciation for multiple forms of knowing. His joke about asking the janitor when doubt arose landed with laughter that held no mockery, recognition that hierarchy based on wisdom trumped hierarchy based on diplomas. The moment represented cultural shift that extended beyond Skyline's operations, rippled through industry conversations about safety protocols and institutional humility. Afternoon brought Garrett to elementary school pickup, routine that new schedule accommodated rather than disrupted. Natalie emerged from building wearing junior inspector badge Diana had commissioned. Her new continuous glucose monitor, courtesy of Kane's Unlimited Healthcare, chirped softly under her sleeve, a sound Garrett had learned meant stable levels without needing to check his phone. Technology and instinct working together, just like he'd taught the engineers. She climbed into truck's passenger seat, chattering about strange noise in school bus engine, about how she'd told driver who'd investigated and found loose serpentine belt, about how listening saved problems before they became emergencies. Garrett's hug communicated pride that transcended parental bias, recognized genuine skill inheritance that connected Catherine's perfect pitch through Natalie's acute hearing to practical applications neither mother nor daughter could have predicted. The legacy was auditory and ethical simultaneously, passed through generations as commitment to paying attention and speaking truth, regardless of institutional resistance. Evening found them at Skyline's main hangar, where Diana waited beside aircraft that had started everything, Gulfstream G700 that represented both near catastrophe and successful intervention, symbol of what happened when courage overrode convenience. She greeted them with comfort that friendship had earned, relationship that had evolved beyond professional alliance toward partnership that neither labeled, but both recognized. Walking together through facility that hummed with normal operations, Diana shared news that board had approved Brennan Protocol expansion, that Federal Aviation Administration was mandating dual inspection methodology for all U.S. carriers within 18 months. That approach Skyline had pioneered was becoming industry standard. Garrett's correction came gentle but firm, reminded her that protocol was collaborative achievement rather than individual triumph, that she'd fought institutional battles that made technical innovation possible. Diana's observation about Catherine carried weight of someone who'd learned to honor memories she'd never directly known, pointed out that Garrett's dead wife would be proud not just of safety improvements, but of Natalie learning courage alongside caution. The acknowledgement bridged past and present, recognized that choices made months earlier had created future neither could have designed, but both could inhabit with integrity. They stopped at memorial plaque mounted on hangar wall, polished brass with inscription that honored Captain Wyatt Sterling without dwelling on tragedy, celebrated final transmission that had challenged Garrett to trust judgment even when institutions dismissed it. Garrett touched the cool metal that bore his friend's name. Natalie's smaller hand joined his. "What would Captain Sterling think of your work now, Daddy?" Garrett knelt beside her, eye level with his daughter and the memorial. "I think he'd say the same thing he said on that last flight. Always trust the ghost. Except now, I finally do." He stood, feeling lighter than he had in 7 years. Sterling could rest easier knowing his death had catalyzed changes that would prevent similar losses. Sunset approached with timing that felt orchestrated despite being entirely coincidental, turned Phoenix sky into layered oranges and purples that made even industrial landscape momentarily beautiful. The three of them stood on tarmac watching Gulfstream begin taxi sequence, aircraft Garrett had saved preparing for departure that represented triumph of attention over assumption, care over credentials. Natalie's hand found her father's while Diana stood close enough that shoulders nearly touched. They hadn't labeled what this was: partnership, friendship, something growing toward more. But Natalie had started calling her Miss Diana with the same comfortable familiarity she used for family, and neither adult had corrected her. Connection built through shared crisis and sustained through mutual respect. The aircraft lifted into evening sky with power and grace that never quite lost capacity to inspire awe, metal, and composite and human ingenuity combining to accomplish flight that remained miraculous regardless of engineering explanation. Catherine's voice emerged not through supernatural intervention but through memory Garrett had internalized so completely it had become conscience. Words from letter he'd read dozens of times until they became internal compass, until "the ghosts don't leave by hiding" became mantra rather than memorial. The hangar's lobby displayed Garrett's old coveralls in museum-quality case, gray fabric bearing grease stains that represented 7 years of deliberate invisibility, accompanied by a plaque explaining journey from maintenance worker to safety director. Beside the uniform sat component that had started transformation, 3-cent spring whose failure had revealed expertise institutions had overlooked, microfracture that had exposed macro blindness in systems designed to prevent exactly what they'd enabled. The artifacts represented more than personal history, testified to principle that mattered beyond individual circumstances. Expertise resided wherever experience had taught wisdom. Credentials predicted past achievement, but judgment determined future outcomes. Listening with attention powered by care detected what expensive sensors missed. Visitors would read the display and understand that revolution sometimes started with willingness to hear what machines whispered, that safety required humility alongside technology, that invisible people often saw what prominent positions obscured. The city lights began their evening illumination, Phoenix transforming from daytime functionality to nighttime beauty. Ordinary Friday in March that marked no particular anniversary, but represented accumulated choices that had rebuilt lives from grief and fear toward purpose and engagement. Garrett stood between his daughter and his partner, watching aircraft disappear into darkening sky. Natalie's hand in his left, Diana's shoulder brushing his right. The 3-cent spring glinted in its display case behind them. A monument to the smallest failures that whispered loudest. Catherine's voice had been right all along. The ghosts didn't leave by hiding from them. They left when you finally finished the work they died trying to complete. Above Phoenix, the Gulf Stream's navigation lights blinked red and green against purple sky, carrying 12 souls who would never know the maintenance worker who'd saved their lives 8 months ago, who'd learned to hear what machines whispered and what the dead still taught. Natalie looked up at her father. "Daddy, can we come back tomorrow? I want to show my class the spring that changed everything." Garrett smiled, squeezed her hand. "Every day if you want, sweetheart. It's our story now. And stories are meant to be shared." The hangar doors closed behind them as they walked toward the truck, toward home with a backyard and a piano and a future built on courage instead of fear. The Phoenix night wrapped them in familiar warmth. Somewhere above, Sterling was finally resting. Somewhere in memory, Catherine was finally proud. The listening continued. It always would.